Smoky the Cowhorse by Will James. Preface. To my way of thinking, there's something wrong or missing with any person who hasn't got a soft spot in their heart for an animal of some kind. With most folks, the dog stands highest as man's friend. Then comes the horse. With others, the cat is liked best as a pet, or a monkey is fussed over. But whatever kind of animal it is a person likes, it's all hunky-dory so long as there's a place in the heart for one or a few of them. I've never as yet went wrong in sizing up a man by the kind of a horse he rode. A good horse always packs a good man, and I've always dodged the hombre that had no thought nor liking for his horse or other animals, for I figure that kind of gazabo is best to be left unacquainted with. No good would ever come of the meeting. With me, my weakness lays towards the horse. My life, from the time I first squinted at daylight, has been with horses. I admire every step that creature makes. I know them and been through so much with them that I've come to figure a big mistake was made when the horse was classed as an animal. To me, the horse is man's greatest, most useful, faithful, and powerful friend. He never whines when he's hungry or sore-footed or tired, and he'll keep on a-going for the human till he drops. The horse is not appreciated, and never will be appreciated enough. Few humans, even them that works him, really know him. But then there's so much to know about him. I've wrote this book on only one horse, and when I first started it, I was afraid I'd run out of something to write. But I wasn't half through when I began to realize I had to do some squeezing to get the things in I wanted. And when I come to the last chapter was when I seen how if I spent my life writing on the horse alone and lived to be 100, I'd only said maybe half of what I feel ought to be said. The horse I wrote of in this book is not an exception. There's quite a few like him. He's not a fiction horse that's wrote about in a dream and made to do things that's against the nature of a horse to do. Smoky is just a horse, but all horse, and that, I think, is enough said. As for Clint, the cowboy who started Smoky, he's no exception either. He's just a man who was able to see and bring out the good that was in the horse. And no matter how some writers describe the cowboy's handling of horses, I'm here to say that I can produce many a cowboy that can show feelings for a horse the same as Clint done. But Smoky met other humans besides Clint, many others, and of all kinds, and that's where the story comes in. And now, my main ambition as I turn Smoky loose to make hisself acquainted is that the folks who will get to know him will see that horse as I seen him. Will James. Chapter 1 of Smoky the Cowhorse. A Range Colt. It seemed like Mother Nature was sure agreeable that day when the little black colt came to the range world and tried to get a footing with his long, wobbly legs on the brown prairie sod. Short stems of new green grass was trying to make their way up through the last year's faded growth and reaching for the sun's warm rays. Taking in all that could be seen, felt, and inhaled, there was no day, time, nor place that could beat the spring morning on the sunny side of the low prairie butte where Smoky the colt was foaled. Smoky wouldn't have fitted the colt as a name just then on account he was jet black. But that name wasn't attached onto him till he was a 4-year-old, which was when he first started being useful as a saddle horse. He didn't see the first light of day through no box stall window, and there was no human around to make a fuss over him and try to steady him on his feet for them first few steps. Smoky was just a little range colt, and all the company he had that first morning of his life was his watchful mammy. Smoky wasn't quite an hour old when he began to take interest in things. The warm spring sun was doing its work and kept a pouring warmth all over that slick little black hide and right on through his little body till pretty soon his head came up kind of shaky and he began nosing around them long front legs that was stretched out in front of him. His mammy was close by him, and at the first move the colt made, she run her nose along his short neck and nickered. Smoky's head went up another 2 inches at the sound, and his first little answering nicker was heard. Of course, a person would have had to listen mighty close to hear it. But then, if you'd watched his nostrils quivering, you could tell that's just what he was trying to do. That was the starting of Smoky. Pretty soon his ears began to work back and forth towards the sound his mammy would make as she moved. He was trying to locate just where she was. Then something moved right in front of his nose about a foot. It had been there quite a good spell, but he'd never realized it before. Besides, his vision was a little dim yet, and he wasn't interested much till that something moved again and planted itself still closer. Being it was right close, he took a sniff at it. That sniff recorded itself into his brain, and as much as told him that all was well. It was one of his mammy's legs. His ears perked up, and he tried nickering again, with a heap better result than the first time. One good thing called for another, and natural-like he made a sudden scramble to get up, but his legs wouldn't work right, and just about when he'd got his belly clear of the ground, and as he was resting there for another try at the rest of the way up, one of his front legs quivered and buckled at the elbow, and the whole works went down. He laid there flat on his side and breathing hard. His mammy nickered encouragement, and it wasn't long when his head was up again and his legs spraddled out all around him the same as before. He was going to try again, but next time he was going to be more sure of his ground. He was studying, it seemed like, and sniffing of his legs and then the earth like he was trying to figure out how he was going to get one to stand up on the other. His mammy kept circling around and talking to him in horse language. She'd give him a shove with her nose, then walk away and watch him. The spring air, which I think is most for the benefit of all that's young, had a lot to do to keep Smoky from laying still for very long. His vision was getting clearer fast, and his strength was coming in just as fast. Not far away, but still too far for Smoky to see, was little calves. Little white-faced fellers a-playing and a-bucking around and letting out wall-eyed bellers at their mammies, running out a ways and then running back, tails up, at a speed that'd make a greyhound blush for shame. There was other little colts, too, all a-cavorting around and tearing up good sod. But with all them calves and colts that was with the bunches of cattle or horses scattered out on the range, the same experience of helplessness that Smoky was going through had been theirs for a spell, and a few hadn't been as lucky as Smoky in their first squint at daylight. Them few had come to the range world when the ground was still covered with snow, or else cold spring rains was a-pouring down to wet 'em to the bone. Smoky's mother had sneaked out of the bunch a few days before Smoky came, and hid in a lonely spot where she'd be sure that no cattle nor horses or even riders would be around. In a few days, and when Smoky would be strong enough to lope out, she'd go back again. But in the meantime she wanted to be alone with her colt and put all her attention on him without having to contend with chasing off big inquisitive geldings or jealous fillies. She was of range blood, which means mostly Mustang with strains of steel dust or coach throwed in. If hard winters come and the range was covered with heavy snows, she knowed of high ridges where the strong winds kept a few spots bare and where feed could be got. If droughts came to dry up the grass and water holes, she sniffed the air for moisture and drifted out across to the plain which was her home range, to the high mountains where things was more normal. There was cougars and wolves in that high country, but her Mustang instinct made her the fittest. She circled around and never went under where the lion was perched awaiting for her, and the wolf never found her where she could be cornered. Smoky had inherited that same instinct of his mammy's, but on that quiet spring morning he wasn't at all worried about enemies. His mammy was there. And besides, he had a hard job ahead that was taking all of his mind to figure out. That was to stand on them long things which was fastened to his body and which kept spraddling out in all directions. The first thing to do was to gather 'em under him and try again. He did that easy enough, and then he waited and gathered up all the strength that was in him. He sniffed at the ground to make sure it was there, and then his head went up. His front feet stretched out in front of him, and with his hind legs all under him, he used all that strength he'd been storing up and pushed himself up on his front feet. His hind legs straightened up to steady him, and as luck would have it, there was just enough distance between each leg to keep him there. All he had to do was to keep them legs stiff and from buckling up under him, which wasn't at all easy, 'cause getting up to where he was had used up a lot of his strength, and them long legs of his was doing a heap of shaking. All would have been well, maybe, only his mammy nickered, "That's a good boy," and that's what queered Smoky. His head went up, proud as a peacock, and he forgot all about keeping his props stiff and under him. Down he went, the whole length of his legs, and there he laid the same as before. But he didn't lay long this time. He either liked the sport of going up and coming down, or else he was getting peeved. He was up again, mighty shaky, but he was up sure enough. His mammy came to him. She sniffed at him, and he sniffed back. Then nature played another hand, and he nursed. The first nourishment was took in. His tummy warmed up, and strength came fast. Smoky was an hour and a half old and up to stay. The rest of that day was full of events for Smoky. He explored the whole country, went up big mountains 2 feet high, wide valleys 6 or 8 feet across, and at one time was as far as 12 feet away from his mammy all by himself. He shied at a rock once. It was a dangerous-looking rock, and he kicked at it as he went past. All that action being put on at once come pretty near being too much for him, and he come close to measuring his whole length on Mother Earth once again. But luck was with him, and taking it all, he had a mighty good time. When the sun went to sinking over the blue ridges in the west, Smoky, he missed all the beauty of the first sunset in his life. He was stretched out full length of his own accord this time, and sound asleep. The night was a mighty good rival of what the day had been. All the stars was out and showing off, and the braves was a-chasing the buffalo plumb around the Big Dipper, the water hole of the happy hunting grounds. But all that was lost to Smoky. He was still asleep and recuperating from his first day's adventures, and most likely he'd kept on sleeping for a good long spell, only his mammy who was standing guard over him happened to get a little too close and stepped on his tail. Smoky must have been in the middle of some bad dream. His natural instinct might have pictured some enemy to his mind, and something that looked like a wolf or a bear must have had him cornered for sure. Anyway, when he felt his tail pinched that way, he figured that when a feller begins to feel, it's sure time to act, and he did. He shot up right under his mammy's chin, let out a squeal, and stood there ready to fight. He took in the country for feet and feet around, and looking for the enemy that had nipped him, and finally in his scouting around that way, he run across to the shadow of his mammy. That meant but one thing, safety, and that accounted for and put away as past, left room for a craving he'd never noticed in his excitement. He was hungry, and proceeded right then and there to take on a feed of his mammy's warm, rich milk. The sky was beginning to get light in the east. The stars was fading away, and the buffalo hunters had went to rest. A few hours had passed since Smoky had been woke up out of his bad dream, and there he was, asleep again. He'd missed his first sunset, and now he was sleeping through his first sunrise. But he was going to be prepared for that new day's run, and the strength he was accumulating through them sleeps and between feeds would sure make him fit to cover a lot of territory. There wasn't a move out of him till the sun was well up and beginning to throw a good heat. He stacked up on a lot of that heat, and pretty soon one of his ears moved, then the other. He took a long breath and stretched. Smoky was coming to life. His mammy nickered, and that done the trick. Smoky raised his head, looked around, and proceeded to get up. After a little time that was done, and bowing his neck, he stretched again. Smoky was ready for another day. The big day started right after Smoky had his feed. Then his mother went to grazing and moving away straight to the direction of some trees a mile or so to the south. A clear spring was by them trees, and water is what Smoky's mammy wanted the most right then. She was craving for a drink of that cold water, but you'd never thought it by the way she traveled. She'd nose around at the grass and wait for spells so as little Smoky could keep up with her, and still find time to investigate everything that throwed a shadow. A baby cottontail had jumped up once right under his nose, stood there a second, too scared to move, and pretty soon made a high dive between the colt's long legs and hit for his hole. Smoky never seen the rabbit, or even knowed he was there, or he might have been running yet, 'cause that's what he'd been looking for, an excuse to run. But he finally made up an excuse, and a while later, as he brushed past a long dry weed and it tickled his belly, he let out a squeal and went from there. His long legs tangled and untangled themselves as he run, and he was sure making speed. Around and around he went and finally lined out straight away from where his mammy was headed. She nickered for him and waited, all patience. He turned after a spell and headed for his mammy again, the same as though he'd run across another enemy at the other end. And as he got close to his mammy, he let out a buck, a squeal, and a snort, and stopped. He was sure some little wild horse. It took a couple of hours for them two to make that mile to the spring. The mother drank a lot of that good water, a few long breaths, and drank some more till the thirst was all gone. Smoky came over and nosed at the pool, but he didn't take on any of the fluid. It looked just like so much thin air to him, the same with the tender green grass that was beginning to grow in bunches everywhere. It was just growing for him to run on. The rest of that day was pretty well used up around that one spot. Adventures of all kinds was numerous for Smoky, and when he wasn't stretched out and asleep, there was plenty of big stumps in the cottonwood grove that could be depended on to give him the scare he'd be looking for. But there was other things and more threatening than stumps which Smoky hadn't as yet spotted. Like, for instance, a big coyote had squatted and been watching him through dead willow branches. He wasn't at all interested in the action Smoky was putting into his play, and only wished the colt's mammy would move away a little further, when he would then take a chance and try to get him down. Colt meat was his favorite dish, and he sure wasn't going to let no chance slip by, even if it took a whole day's waiting for one to show itself. A couple of chances had come his way, but they was queered by Smoky's mammy being too close, and he knowed better than show himself and get run down by them hoofs of hers. Finally, and when he seen his appetite wouldn't win anything by sticking around that spot any longer, he took a last sniff and came out of his hiding place. Keeping the willows between him and the horses, he loped out till he was at a safe running distance, and where he could see all around him, and there he squatted again, in plain sight this time. He hadn't quite made up his mind as yet whether to go or stick around a while longer. Just about then, Smoky spots him. To him, the coyote was just another stump, but more interesting than the others he'd kicked at on account that this stump moved, and that promised a lot of excitement. With a bowed neck and kinked tail, Smoky trotted up toward the coyote. The coyote just sat there and waited, and when the colt got to within a few feet of him, he started away, and just fast enough so as the colt's curiosity would make him follow. If he could only get the colt over the ridge and out of his mammy's sight. It all was only a lot of fun to Smoky, and besides he was bound to find out what was that gray and yellow object that could move and run and didn't at all look like his mammy. His instinct was warning him steady as he went, but curiosity had the best of him, and it wasn't till he was over the hill before his instinct got above his curiosity and he seen that all wasn't well. The coyote had turned and quicker than a flash made a jump for Smoky's throat. The generations of Mustang blood that had fought the Lobo and Cougar, and which was the same blood that flowed in Smoky's veins, is all that saved the colt. That inherited instinct made him do the right thing at the right time. He whirled quicker than lightning and let fly with both hind feet, with the result that the coyote's teeth just pinched the skin under his jaws. But even at that, he wasn't going to get rid of his enemy. It was a sure enough enemy this time. That easy, and as he kicked he felt the weight of the coyote, and then a sharp pain on his hamstrings. Smoky was scared, and he let out a squeal that sure made every living thing in that neighborhood set up in wonder. It was a plain and loud distress signal, and it was answered. His mammy shot up the hill, took in the goings-on at a glance, and ears back, teeth a-shining, tore up the earth and lit into the battle like a ton of dynamite. The battle was over in a second, and with hunks of yellow fur a-flying all directions, it wound up in a chase. The coyote was in the lead, and he stayed in the lead till a second hill took him out of sight. Smoky was glad to follow his mammy back to the spring and on to the other side a ways. He didn't shy at the stumps he passed on the way, and the twig that tickled his tummy didn't bring no play. He was hungry and tired, and when the first was tended to and his appetite called for no more, he lost no time to picking out a place to rest his weary bones. A thin stream of blood was drying on one of his hind legs, but there was no pain, and when the sun set and the shadow of his mammy spread out over him, he was sound asleep, and maybe dreaming of stumps that moved. When the sun came up the next morning, Smoky was up too, and eyes half closed was standing still as the big boulder next to him, and sunned himself. A stiff hind leg was a reminder of what happened the day before, but the experience was forgotten, far as dampening his spirits was concerned. Even the stiffness wouldn't hold him back from whatever the new day would hold. He'd always remember the coyote, and from then on never mistake him for a stump, but that sure wasn't going to take any play out of him. He was 2 days old now, and strength had piled up fast. He felt there was no trail too long for him, and when the sun was a couple of hours high that morning, and his mother showed indications that she wanted to drift, he sure wasn't dragging along behind. The stiffness gradually went out of his hind legs as he traveled, and by afternoon of that day he was again shying at everything and sometimes even shying at nothing at all. They kept a-traveling and traveling, and it seemed like to Smoky that the trail was getting pretty long after all. They skirted the flat along the foot of the mountains, crossed one high ridge and many creeks, and still his mother was drifting on. She wouldn't hardly even stop for him to nurse, and Smoky was getting cranky and tired. The pace kept up till the sun was well on its way down, when it slackened some, and finally the mother went to grazing. A short while later, Smoky was laid out full length and dead to the world. Smoky didn't know and didn't care much just then, but his mammy was headed back to her home range, where there was lots of horses and other little colts for him to play with. And when late that night she lined out again traveling steady, he wasn't in any too good a humor. Finally it seemed like they'd got there, for his mammy, after watering at a creek, went to grazing at the edge of some big cottonwoods. She showed no indications of wanting to go any further. Right there Smoky was willing to take advantage of the chance and recuperate for all he was worth. The sun came up, but Smoky was in the shade of the cottonwoods, what was beginning to leaf out. He slept on, and a twitching ear once in long spells is all that showed he was still alive. That day never seen much of him. Once in a while he'd get up and nurse, but right away after he'd disappear again and stretch out flat on the warm earth. He kept that up till way in the middle of the next night, and it was well towards morning before he felt like he was all horse again. He come out of it in fine shape, though, and he was stronger than ever. His vision was taking more territory, too, and he was getting so he could see near half as far as his mammy could. She was the first to see the bunch of range horses trailing in to water early that morning. Smoky heard her nicker as she recognized the bunch, and it drawed a heap of interest as to what she was nickering about, for he was right there alongside of her, and he couldn't see nothing for her to nicker at. But pretty soon he could hear the horses as they trailed towards him. His ears straightened towards the sound, and a while later he could make out the shapes of 'em. Smoky just kind of quivered at the sight of so many that looked like his mammy. He was all interested, but at the same time, and even though his instinct told him that all was well, he had no hankering to leave his mammy's side till he knowed for sure just what was up. The mother watched the bunch coming closer with ears pointed straight ahead, but soon as some of the leaders discovered little Smoky, there was a commotion, and they all began crowding in to get a look at and greet the newcomer, about which time the mother laid her ears back. It was a warning that none of 'em come too close. Little Smoky's knees was a shaking under him at the sight of so many of his kind. He leaned against his mammy half afraid, but his head was up far as he could get it and facing 'em, and showed by the shine in his eyes that he liked the whole proceeding mighty well at that. He rubbed nostrils with a strange gelding which was braver than the rest and dared come close. And when that gelding was nipped at by his mammy, he had a mighty strong hankering to help her along just for fun and nip him himself. The preliminary introduction took a good hour, and the mother stood guard, not for fear that any of 'em would harm Smoky, but she wanted it understood from the start that he was her little colt and she had the say over him. It finally was understood, but it took all that day and part of the next for the bunch to get used in having the new little fellow around and quit making a fuss over him. They was all jealous of one another and fought amongst themselves to be the only one near him, and his mother, of course, she declared herself from the start. And it was took for granted from all around that her place in Smoky's heart couldn't be considered, and all knowed better than try and chase her away from him. Fillies and old mares, young geldings and old ponies and all, had it out as to which was the most fit to tag along and play with Smoky, and keep a watchful eye over him along with his mammy. All wanted the job, but a big buckskin saddle horse, who all the time had been the boss of the herd, took it to hand to show them that he would be the all-around guardian for Smoky, and second only to his mammy. He delivered a few swift kicks, pounded on some ribs, left teeth marks on shiny hides, and after taking one last look and making sure that all was persuaded, grazed out towards Smoky, who by his mammy had watched the whole proceeding with a heap of interest. There was 3 other little colts in the bunch besides Smoky, and each time one of them little fellers came, the buckskin horse had to whip the bunch so as he'd have the say over the newest one. Now Smoky was the newest one, and the buckskin horse had first rights as an outsider once again. He was an old horse, full of scars showing where he'd had many a scrap. There was saddle marks on his back, and at one time had been a mighty fine cow horse. Now he was pensioned, he'd more than earned a rest, and all he had to do for the rest of his life was to pick out good feed grounds for the winter, shady places, and tenderest green grass for the summer, and his other interest in life was them little colts that came in the springtime. Smoky's mother was young, at least 10 years younger than the buckskin horse, but the buckskin was like a colt compared to her when it come to be playful. She had the responsibility of Smoky, and while she let him play with her, kick or bite at her, she never played with him, and once in a while, if he'd get too rough, she'd let him know about it. She loved little Smoky with all her heart, and would have died for him any time, and her main interest was to see that she kept in condition so that Smoky would never be stunted by lack of rich milk. She had no time for play. And that's where the old buckskin came in. Him and Smoky was soon acquainted. In a short while they was playing. Smoky would kick at him while the big buckskin nipped him easy and careful along the flank. Then he'd run away from him, and the little colt had a lot of fun chasing that big hunk of horse flesh all over the country. The rest of the bunch would watch the two play, and with no effort to hide how jealous they felt. Smoky's mother kept her eye on the buckskin, but never interfered. She knowed, and it was only when Smoky came back to her tired and hungry that she put her ears back and warned him to keep away. It took a few days before the buckskin would allow any of the other horses to get near Smoky, and then he had no say about it, for he found that Smoky had his own ideas about things, and if he wanted to mingle in with the other horses, that was his business, and all the buckskin could do then was to try and keep the other horses away. That was quite a job, especially if Smoky wanted to be with them. So the buckskin finally had to give it up and do the best he could, which was to see that none of 'em done him any harm. But none of 'em had any intentions of doing the little colt any harm, and as it was, it looked like Smoky had 'em all buffaloed. He'd tear in after some big horse like he was going to eat him up, and all that big horse would do was scatter out like the devil was after him. Smoky was the boss and pet of the herd for a good 2 weeks. And then one day, here comes another little feller, a little bay colt, just 2 days old and trailing in alongside his mammy. Smoky was left in the background and witnessed the same fuss and commotion that was done over him that morning by the creek. The buckskin horse once again fought his way in that new little feller's heart, and right away he forgot Smoky. But Smoky never seen anything wrong to that. He went on to playing with every horse that would have him, and it wasn't long till he picked up with a young filly and afterwards went to mingling with other young colts. From then on, Smoky had more freedom. He could go out a ways without having some big overgrowed horse tagging along, but he never went far, and if he did, he always came back a heap faster than when he started out. But them spring days was great for Smoky. He found out a lot of things, amongst which was that grass was good to eat and water mighty fine to drink when the day was hot. He seen coyotes again, and the bigger he got, the less he was afraid of 'em, till he finally went to chasing every one of 'em he'd see. Then one day he run across another yellow animal. That animal didn't look dangerous, and what's more, it was hard for Smoky to make out just what it was, and he was bound to find out. He followed that animal plumb to the edge of some willows, and the queer part of it was that animal didn't seem at all in a hurry to get away. It was mumbling along and just taking its time, and Smoky was mighty tempted to plant one front foot right in the middle of it and do some pawing, but as luck would have it, he didn't have the chance. It had got in under some willows, and all that was sticking out was part of the animal's tail. Smoky took a sniff at it without learning anything outside that it shook a little. There didn't seem to be no danger, so the next sniff he took was a little closer, and that done the trick. Smoky let out a squeal and a snort as he felt his nostrils punctured in 6 places with 4-inch porcupine quills. But Smoky was lucky, for if he'd been a couple of inches closer, there'd been quills rammed into his nose plumb up to his eyes, which would have caused a swelling in such size that he couldn't have been able to eat and most likely starved to death. As it was, there was just a few of them quills in his nostrils, and compared to the real dose he might have got, it was just a mild warning to him. Another lesson. It was a few days later when he met another strange animal, or strange animals, for there was many of 'em. He didn't get much interest out of them somehow, But while they was handy, maybe it was just as well for him to have a close look at one. Besides, he had nothing else to do, and his mammy wasn't far away. His instinct had no warning to give as he strutted towards the smallest one of the strangers which he'd picked to investigate. He wasn't afraid of this animal, and this animal didn't seem afraid of him. So Smoky kept a-getting closer till one was within a couple of feet of the other. Both Smoky and this stranger was young and mighty inquisitive, and neither as yet knowed that they'd sure be seeing plenty of each other's kind as they get older, that they'll be meeting through the roundups at the cutting grounds, on day herd and on night guard, on the long, hot, and dusty trails. A cowboy will be riding Smoky then, and keeping a whole herd on the move, a whole herd of the kind that little Smoky was so busy investigating that day. They'll be full grown then, and there'll be other young ones to take the place of them that's trailed into the shipping point. But Smoky wasn't as yet worried or even thought on what was to come. Neither was the little white-faced calf he was exchanging squints with. And when the critter called her long-eared, split-hoofed baby to her side, Smoky just kicked up his heels, put his head down, and bucked and crow-hopped all the way to where his mammy and the rest of the bunch was grazing. Chapter 2 of Smoky the Cowhorse. Smoky Meets the Human. The long spring days followed by the warmer days of middle summer had took away all signs of snow, excepting where the peaks was highest and the canyons deep and narrow. Up there was crusted hunks still holding out against the sun and hugging the shady sides of rocky ledges, and leaving out moisture that kept the springs and creeks running to the flats below. The grass was greener up there, the flies wasn't so bad, and besides there was always a breeze and sometimes a wind which made things mighty cooling, especially in the shade of the twisted pines scattered over the country where Smoky, his mammy, and the bunch was ranging. That high, rocky, and rough territory had a lot to do in the makings of Smoky. Playing down the steep ridges where shale rock made the footing slippery and mighty uncertain had took all the wobble and shake out of his legs. They fit to his body more and rounded up in size so as they looked like they really belonged to him. His hoofs had long ago lost their pink soft shell and turned to steel gray and were near as hard and tough as steel itself. And the way he'd buck and play down a rocky canyon and jump over down timber may not have compared with the mountain goat for sureness, but he more than made up for that in speed and recklessness, and somehow he'd always hit the bottom right side up. It was in one of them wild scrambles down a mountainside one day that Smoky near run into a cinnamon cub, which had been curled up and sleeping on top of a big stump. Smoky stood in his tracks for a second, and in that second the cub fell off the stump with a snarl and lit a-running on the other side. The action of the cub is what decided Smoky whether to stand still, turn back and hightail it, or follow and investigate. But his curiosity was still with him, and bowing his neck, he paced high and mighty on the trail of the hairy puzzle. Over dead timber he went, sailed across washes, and ducked under branches. He was gaining, and would have kept the chase up for quite a spell, only just when things was getting real interesting, there was a crash, and to his right a dust and a commotion which sounded like a landslide. In half a second more, a big round brown head showed itself through a tangle of broken limbs and underbrush. Smoky got a glimpse of two small eyes afire, long white teeth a-gleaming, and when all the sudden apparition was backed by a roar that near shook the mountains, Smoky left. He tore a hole in the earth as he turned tail, and he wasn't pacing high and mighty as he made distance and raced back towards his mammy and safety. His heart was thumping fit to bust as he cleared the timber and got out in open country, and for the life of him he couldn't figure out how that little bunch of fur he'd been chasing could turn out into such a scenery-tearing cyclone as what he'd got a glimpse of. He'd never reckoned the little cub had a mammy, too. But Smoky was learning fast, and along with his own experiences, he learned from his mother just what was in the timber and on the flats. Like another time on the foothills, his mammy was in the lead and him following close behind on a hot, dusty trail towards a shady spot. Of a sudden, there was a rattling sound, and just as sudden his mammy left the trail as though she'd been shot. Instinct made Smoky do the same, and none too soon. For on the left, just a foot or so off the trail, was a wriggling thing that had just struck and missed to reach his ankle by an inch. Smoky stood off at a safe distance and snorted at it as it coiled up ready. Somehow he had no hankering to go stick his nose nowheres near or take a sniff at the gray and dirty yellow-colored rattler. And when his mammy nickered for him to follow, there was a warning in her nicker. He took another look at the snake. He'd remember and do the same as his mother had done whenever the rattling sound would be heard again. Taking in all, Smoky was getting mighty wise, along with being mighty lucky in getting that wisdom. Scratches is about all he ever packed out of any scramble, and scratches didn't count with him. His hide was getting tough, and the blood that flowed in his veins wasn't from a heart that'd peter out very easy. The little horse was having a great time up in that high country, and if he'd seen more of life, he'd most likely wondered how long it all was going to last. It would have struck him as too good to last much longer. But as it was, Smoky took in all that life could give and enjoyed it to the limit. He never passed anything which had him wondering for fear of missing something. If a limb cracked anywheres within hearing distance, he'd perk his ears towards the sound and seldom would go on till he found out just why that limb cracked that way. He'd follow and pester the badger till it'd hunt a hole. He'd circle around a tree and watch the bushy-tailed squirrel as it climbed up out of his reach. Skunks had crossed his trail too, but somehow the atmosphere around him would sort of dampen his curiosity, and he always kept his distance. Smoky had met and had experiences with all the range country's wild animals, excepting the lion and the wolf. His mammy kept clear of the territory where them outlaws ranged, and if by scent the bunch suspicioned them two as neighbors, they'd drift, or else keep on the lookout till the others had drifted. Smoky met them too and had scrambles with them, but that came later in his life. And it's a good thing it was later, for I most likely wouldn't be telling about Smoky now. The first big event in Smoky's life came when he was 4 months old. There was nothing to tell him anything would happen, no dark skies nor ill winds to threaten or warn. And as it was, the little feller was just in the steady motion of keeping one end of himself clear of the few flies that was around. That short tail of his was working like a pendulum. He was standing up and asleep. The breeze blowed through his mane, and that same breeze made a sort of lullaby as it passed through the branches of the big pine that shaded him and his mammy. His mammy was asleep too, and so was the rest of the bunch. And when the cowboy that was riding up the canyon spotted him, he knowed he could get above 'em and be where he could start 'em down before any of the bunch would see him. It was a mighty good thing he done that, for soon as one of the bunch got wind of him and raised a head, there was a snort. They came to life and was on the run in a split second. Down the side of the canyon they went, a cloud of dust and the cowboy following. Smoky was right with the bunch from the start. He stampeded with the leader, and once in his life it never came to him to wonder what it was all about. He just run and plumb forgot to investigate. Tails was a popping as the horses slid off the mountain, jumped off ledges, and sailed across washouts. Loosened rocks bumped against boulders. Boulders crashed into dead hanging timber, and pretty soon a landslide brought up the rear, but even that was too slow. The ponies and the cowboy behind 'em hit the bottom of the canyon first, and when the slide reached that spot and filled the canyon with 10 feet of boulders, timber, and dirt, The whole wild bunch was half a mile away and kicking up dust on the foothills at the edge of the flat. It was away out on the flat and where the dust wasn't so thick that Smoky took a back slant over his withers and got his first sight of the human. The way his mammy and the rest of the bunch acted, the way they run and tried to dodge or leave that human behind, sure put the impression in Smoky's mind that here was a different kind of animal, the kind that no horse would stop to fight or argue with, but instead run away from if it was possible. But it didn't seem possible, for the rider was still right on their tails and stayed there till he drove 'em into the long wings of big log corrals, which to Smoky seemed like trees growing sideways instead of up and down. But the little horse knowed that there was no going through them trees. He stuck close as he could to his mammy's side. She and the bunch milled around for a spell around the big pen. The big gate closed on 'em, and wild-eyed the bunch turned and faced a bow-legged, leather-covered, sunburnt human. Smoky shivered as he watched that strange creature get off one of his kin, a horse just like any of the bunch him and his mammy was running with, all excepting for that funny hunk of leather on his back. Pretty soon the human fumbled around a while, and then that hunk of leather was pulled off. The horse was turned loose, shook himself, and walked towards Smoky and the bunch. The colt was starry-eyed and never missed a thing, and soon as the loose horse came his way, he took a sniff at his sweaty hide for some kind of a clue as to what had been setting on him all through that long run. The sniff left him more puzzled than ever, and forgetting the horse, he put all his attention on the creature which was standing up and on two legs. There'd been a lot of lightning up in the mountains where Smoky had been ranging that summer. He'd seen some fires up there, too. That lightning and them fires was great puzzles to the colt, and when he seen the human make a swift move with a paw, and then seen a fire in one of them paws, and later on smoke coming out of the mouth, it all made things more than ever impossible for him to figure out. He stood petrified and watched. Pretty soon, them same paws that had held the fire reached down and picked up a coil of rope. A loop was made, and then the human walked towards him and the bunch. At that move, the bunch tore around the corral and raised the dust. Then Smoky heard the hiss of a rope as it sailed over past him, and the loop settled on one of the pony's heads. The pony was stopped and led out to the hunk of leather on the ground. It was cinched on him the same as it had been on the other horse, and when the human climbed on is when Smoky first set eyes on one of his kind in a fight with the two-legged creature. It was a great sight to the colt. He'd seen some of his bunch play and kick often, and he'd done a lot of that himself. But he'd never seen any get in the position and tear things up the way that pony was doing. He knowed that pony was fighting, bucking for all he was worth, and doing his doggonedest to shed that sticking and ill-built wonder that was on top of him. Smoky watched and shook when he heard the pony beller. He'd never heard one of his kind make that noise before, and he knowed without wondering just what the beller meant. He remembered doing near the same that time when the coyote had nipped him in the hamstrings. Smoky's eyes was blazing as he watched on through the fight, and the pony's hard jumps dwindled down to crow hops and then a stop. He watched the man as he got off the horse, opened the gate, led the horse out, and after closing it, watched him ride on and out of sight. It wasn't till then that he came back to himself, and it come to his mind to investigate the kind of place it was that cooped him in. He rubbed noses with his mammy and went to scouting around the big corral. Long strands of mane which had caught in slivers of the logs told him there'd been lots of horses here before. Sniffs at the ground, and more sniffs at pieces of calves' ears that had been cut while ear-marking, reminded him of the critter he'd seen while he was only a couple of weeks old. Many calves had been branded in the big corral, and with all them signs, which was plain enough reading to Smoky, it only made him all the more suspicious and spooky. He was trying to get up enough nerve to go near and take a sniff at a pair of chaps hanging on the corral gate when he noticed a dust, and under it a band of horses being hazed towards the corral he was in. With that band was a half-dozen riders or more, and the sight of them made Smoky hightail to his mammy's side in a hurry. Once there, he took in all that could be seen, and watched the riders drive the horses through the gate and turn 'em in with his bunch. There was a lot of dust, milling around, and confusion, for there was now near 200 head of horses in the one big corral. But to Smoky all that company was mighty welcome. They meant more protection. He could hide better in that big bunch, and be able to always keep some of the horses between him and them two-legged creathers. He kept hid as well as he could while the bunch milled around the corral, and in a short while, as he watched through the horses' legs, he seen where on the outside and close to the pen a fire was started. Long bars of iron was passed through between the logs, and one end of 'em sticking in the hot blaze. Then pretty soon a commotion was stirred, and the bunch went to racing around the corral and snorting. Many was cut out into another corral, till there was only about 50 left, mostly young colts about Smoky's age, and a few quiet old mares. Smoky had no chance to hide, and as he seen the bow-legged humans uncoil long ropes and heard the loops whiz past him at the speed of a bullet, terror struck in his heart, and he was ready to leave the earth. He heard some of the colts squeal as they were snared, throwed, and tied down, and that sure didn't help to ease the fear that had took hold of him. He was doing his best and keeping as far out of reach as he could, but it seemed like them creathers was everywhere, and no place where them long ropes couldn't reach. It was during one of his wild scrambles for a getaway that Smoky heard the close hiss of a rope, and like a snake coiled itself around both his front legs. He let out a squeal, and in another second he was flat to the ground and 4 feet tied up. Smoky figured the end of the world had come as he felt the human touch him, and if it had been in his blood to faint away, he'd 'a' done it easy. But as it was, he never missed a thing. He seen one of the creathers run towards him with a hot iron, smelled burning hair and hide. It was his own that burned, but it felt cool and there was no pain, for he was at the stage where the searing iron was no worse than a touch from the human hand. But there's an end to all, whether it's good or bad, and pretty soon Smoky felt the ropes come off his legs, a boost to let him know that all was over. And when he stood up and run back to the bunch, there was a mark on his slick hide that was there for life. As the brand read, the little horse belonged to the Rocking R outfit. It was all a mighty great relief to Smoky and the other colts when the branding came to an end, the bunch all put back together, and when the colts found their mammies, all was turned out and free again, free to go back to the high mountain range or run on the flats. Smoky's mammy took the lead, and after the rest of the bunch was through parleying with the strange horses, they joined in with her and the colt, and all strung out for the foothills. The next day they all was up in high country again, and everything of the day before was forgotten all excepting with Smoky and the other little colts. They still remembered some, on account that it had all been mighty new to 'em, and besides, the sting of the fresh brand was there on their left thigh to remind. But as the days went by, and new things happened right along to draw Smoky's interest in life, the happenings at the corral was gradually left behind like a bad dream. The burn healed quick and left a neat brand, all of which growed right with him. Fall came, skies clouded, and the rains was getting cold, and each time it cleared up again, it was a little colder. The sun wasn't making as high a circle, and was steady losing some of its heat. And when after a few mornings' frost the skies clouded again, and the wind blowed a light snow over the high pinnacles, The bunch gradually ranged lower and lower, till when they reached the foothills and finally the flats, the first of the winter had set in, and it was time for 'em to drift to their winter range. Their winter range was low ridges and benches that raised up in the middle of the prairie. There was steep ravines where willows and cottonwoods growed in big patches. The shelter of them was mighty fine when the cold north winds blowed and the howling blizzard made every living thing hunt a hole. Tall grass was there too, and could always be reached by pawing for it. In quiet winter days, when the sun came out and the wind went down, the bunch could always leave their shelter and find places on the ridges where the winds had swept the snow away, and where the grass was in plain sight. Drifting across to that flat, open country and investigating that new winter territory had kept Smoky's eyes, ears, and nostrils mighty busy. There'd been a lot to keep him looking, listening, and sniffing. Every buffalo wallow, coulee, and rise had kept his senses on hair-trigger edge, and when the first snow had come, he'd enjoyed that too. It made him want to buck and play as it fell on his withers and rump. And along with the cold weather that had turned the range brown and then white, he was finding more ambition to keep on the jump. He wasn't looking for shade no more. If Smoky minded the cold, he sure didn't show it. And if you could have felt his warm hide and seen how thick the hair had grown on it and how long, you'd never wonder why it was that the cold raw winds never fazed him. Mother Nature had seen to that, and brought on the winter gradual, till when the time come for it to set in, Smoky was well prepared. He was packing a natural fur coat on a good thick hide, and with an inch of tallow for a lining, and along with the thick, rich blood which he kept in good circulation, he was mighty able to compete with the snows and freezing weather, and was never found to hunt shelter till the blizzard blowed over the ridges from the north. He pawed snow for his feed that winter, for it had been quite a few months before when he found that his mammy's milk wasn't quite enough, and later turned out to be just a taste, and finally she gave him to understand that he was weaned. There was no arguing with her, and Smoky knowed better than to try, so he pawed and hunted for grass like a big horse. He ate snow and could stay away from water as long as any of the bunch. And even though he lost some of his roundness through the worst of the winter, you couldn't have noticed it on account of his hair being so long. Being that Smoky was still quite a privileged character, it helped him considerable through them long winter months. If he'd see some big horse dig down into a special good grassy spot, he'd take advantage of his standing and chase the big horse away. He looked mighty wicked as he put his ears down, showed his teeth, and delivered a side kick. And the big horse would act scared to death, and get away from the dangerous Smoky in a hurry. There was only one in the bunch that wouldn't scare worth a bit, and that was his mammy. He could paw in the same hole with her and maybe steal a bunch of grass right from under her nose, but there was no chasing her away. Most likely there was no such intentions in Smoky's mind anyhow, for the little horse did think an awful lot of that mammy of his. And even though she never played with him, and even nipped him for some things he'd do, he knowed if a showdown ever come, she'd fight to a finish for him. So, as the snows piled high and the ravines filled with drifts, Smoky went on and passed the heart of the winter in near the same carefree, reckless way he'd passed the summer before. Of course, pawing for his feed the way he had to was taking some of his energy, but he'd managed to reserve some for play, and many is the time when you'd see the bunch a-pawing, all intent to reaching the grass, you'd see Smoky tearing up clouds of light snow and a-playing for all he was worth. Other colts would join him, and pretty soon the young ones would have the white scenery all tracked the same as if 1,000 head of horses had stampeded through. The winter wore on that way. No events came to shake the quiet and peace of that part of the range. Only one day a rider had showed up against the skyline. Smoky had been the only one to see him on account he was a little ways from the bunch, and where he could see around a point. With the sight of that rider, Smoky remembered ropes, a corral, and human hands, and he sashayed back to the bunch fast as his legs could carry him. Finally, the first sign of spring came. Smoky couldn't appreciate it very much on account that the warm winds which was starting the snow to melt only left him weak and lazy. His blood hadn't started to thin down as yet, and for the first short spell in his life he had no hankering to crow-hop around and play. Then a few weeks later the bare earth began to show in big spots, and on the sunny side of the buttes green grass began to shoot up. That new green grass tasted mighty good to Smoky. It tasted so good that the dry feed he'd wintered on, and which could now be got without pawing for, was only stepped on in hunting for them first blades of green. Nothing but that would do, and as it was still scarce and hard to find that early in the year, he covered a lot of territory and got very little feed. But the rest of the bunch was afflicted the same way. The long dry grass wasn't good enough no more, and consequences is the bunch lost some weight. But Mother Nature was on hand there again. She knowed that's what the bunch needed to condition 'em for the change of season. And sure enough, pretty soon the warm weather didn't leave 'em so drowsy no more. And as the grass kept a-growing and finally got to be everywhere, on the ridges as on the flats, the bunch perked up again. The long winter hair was loosening, and big hunks of it was left wherever they rolled. Smoky's winter coat had faded to a brown at the first sign of spring, and now that the warmer weather had come and green grass was aplenty, there was another color showed where he'd shed off the long hair. It was what we call mouse color, only maybe darker. No more of the slick black hair that decorated his hide the summer before could be seen. The change of color had showed itself around his ears and flanks, but it wasn't till winter came that the real change had took place and turned him to a grayish mouse color. His head and legs was a little darker than his body and showed brown, and with that little blaze face of his looming up, he made a mighty pretty picture. A picture of the kind once you see, you never forget. For Smoky was perfect any way you looked at him, and it seemed like, as you sized him up, that the other of his kind hadn't been played square with, and some of their good points stole away so as Smoky would be the perfect little horse. Smoky had never thought of his good looks and strong body. His good looks was only a sign of his good health. He felt it all and used it to the limit for his own benefit, and for whatever fun his strength and energy could afford him. That never lacked, and if he laid down it was seldom because he was tired. It was more through a hint from Mother Nature for him to hold on a while and store up on life and more strength. The spring rains came and went, and each time after each spell of moisture, the grass was a little taller and the country greener. The sun kept a-getting warmer, too, and some days was already hot. It was during one of these hot days that Smoky's mother disappeared. Smoky had been snoozing in the shade of a creek bank, and it wasn't till quite a while after he got up and started grazing that he noticed she was gone. The bunch had been drifting back for the summer range and was at the foothills of the big range. The big flat below was an easy place to spot any moving object on, but Smoky couldn't find hide nor hair of that mammy of his. He trotted around the bunch and, nickering, investigated for a spell. She couldn't be found. He took another look at the country around, and, nickering in kind of wonder, he went to grazing again. Somehow he wasn't fidgety as he should have been. Maybe he had a hunch that her disappearing that way was necessary and that all was hunky-dory. Anyway, Smoky never missed any sleep or feed or play while she was gone. Things went on just the same, and the little horse's hide was getting slicker every day. A few days passed, and then one morning the big buckskin horse that was still in the bunch perked up his ears, nickered, and loped out towards the flat. A horse was out there and coming towards the bunch. Alongside the horse was a little moving object. Smoky and the bunch stood in their tracks and watched. Pretty soon, Smoky noticed something familiar in that lone horse coming towards him, but that little object tagging along puzzled him, and head up he trotted out a ways to investigate. Then it all came to him, for the lone horse was none other than his mammy. He lit out on a run, a-nickering as he went, till he got to within a few feet of her, and then he got a slant at the object a-tagging alongside. A brand-new little wobblety-leg colt it was, shining black, and awful timid at the sight of so many strangers. It was Smoky's new little brother. Smoky couldn't keep his nose off the baby, and his mammy had to cock one ear back at him, the same as to say, "Careful, son." But Smoky was careful, and as his mammy went on to join the bunch, he followed, and the big buckskin brought up the rear. From then on, Smoky ranked second. Chapter 3 of Smoky the Cowhorse, Where the Trails Fork. Middle summer had come. The day was hot and still. Even up amongst the high peaks and where the snow was making a last stand, the heat was strong, for the sun was shooting straight down, and the crags could give no more shade. Up on a rocky trail of that country, a small bunch of range horses was drifting one behind the other and following the leader. The leader was Smoky's mammy, the new little black colt right at her heels, and next the blaze-faced, mouse-colored yearling, Smoky. A little further back was a big buckskin horse, and there followed 8 or 10 others, which made up the rest of the bunch. They all trailed along, seemed like headed for nowheres in particular. They passed under wind-twisted trees and right on through the shade they'd give. Cool streams wasn't even sniffed at, and the long stems of grass that was everywhere wasn't at all noticed. They was all just drifting, and maybe only hitting out for another special good part of the high range. A feller watching 'em would have figured that something or other had started 'em on the move. Maybe a rider had been spotted that morning, which had kettled 'em into a run, or else cougars might have been too numerous for comfort. The little bunch kept a-trailing along till they came to where the trail branched, and the leader took the lower one. The little black colt and all the rest followed, all excepting the mouse-colored yearling. The upper trail had drawed that one's interest, and nothing would do but what he had to investigate it for a ways. He kept his nose on the ground as he went, and sniffed for clues of anything that might be of interest to him. He could see the bunch below, and he figured on cutting across to 'em soon as his curiosity was satisfied. Ahead of him a ways, and above the trail, was a big granite boulder a good 10 feet high. A scrub mahogany had found root in a crack of the big rock, and was spreading its branches well over it, and making a good shade. In that shade, and mighty hard to notice, was an object. A long, flat, dark buckskin object, which looked a lot like part of the rock. It was stretched out full length and seemed like without life, only maybe for the tip of its long, round tail, which was jerking up and down. The round head raised an inch at the sound of hoofs on the rocky trail. The ears flattened, and the yellow eyes turned jet black at the sight of Smoky, the mouse-colored yearling. Smoky was coming right on the trail, and would pass to within a couple of feet of the big rock that was the mountain lion's game hunting perch. Many a deer he'd pounce onto and killed from that perch, and not far away from that spot was bones scattered around which showed where he'd drug his victims and ate his fill. Wolves, coyotes, and other varmints had cleaned up what the big lion would leave, and the result was white bones a-shining to the sun. The lion had a big territory which he claimed as his, but in all that rough country there was no better place than the one he was now getting ready to spring from. He'd got meat from that spot when he failed at others, and the trail he overlooked was tracked with many hoofs, Hoofs of all the kind that ranged up there. It was a main trail to a main pass. Why Smoky's mother didn't take that trail can't be explained much. Maybe it was instinct that warned her, and then again she might have got a glimpse of the tall rock, and past experience made her turn to the left. But anyway, she and her young colt and the rest of the bunch was safe and had left Smoky till he was through investigating and ready to catch up with them. Smoky kept on a-coming and edging closer to the rock. He nosed every twig and stone along the trail till he got to within a few feet of the spot where the lion would spring. The lion wasn't a stretched-out shadow no more. He still looked like part of the rock and fitted pretty well with the stump of the scrub mahogany. But he was in a position that sure tallied up with all what was about to happen. He was ready, and still as the rock he was on, and the quiver of his long tail was a-plenty to show that his wiry frame and brain was sure together and intent on one thing. Another foot ahead, and Smoky would be seeing his last of daylight. The colt had one leg raised to make that last step when there's a rattling buzz come from the foot of the rock. A 4-foot rattlesnake stretched out and reaches for Smoky's nose, and that one leg which was raised to go forward went back instead. It was all that saved him. The lion had figured on his victim a-jumping to one side at his leap, and he'd allowed for that. But the way it happened this time was that the snake caused Smoky to jump away just as he'd started, which was a little too soon according to the lion's figuring. And what's more, Smoky went to the wrong direction about a foot, with the result that he just got his claws full of Smoky's mane and no more. He scrambled in mid-air and done his best to get a hold in Smoky's neck. But even with all the action he put in his trying, he struck mostly air and then hard ground. Smoky never waited to see if that flying shadow of sharp claws was after him or not. He'd started at the sound of the rattler and had kept a-moving mighty fast ever since. A few feet of drop in the scenery only helped him make more speed, and the shortcut from the trail he'd left to the trail his mammy and the bunch was on was covered in no time. He lit in the bunch a-running, and the bunch getting a hint from his wild-eyed actions that all wasn't well, started a-running too, and for a ways they all went as though the devil was after 'em. But the devil, if that ain't too mild a name for the lion, wasn't after 'em. He knowed the colt had too much speed for him, and never even thought of following him, and as it was, he was just a-lashing himself with his long tail, and mad clear through at the hout of missing such a nice fat yearling colt as Smoky was. From that day on, Smoky dodged high rocks unless he could see the top of 'em. Pine trees with stout lower limbs had him a-circling too, or any other place where a lion could perch on and spring from. The little horse was gradually getting so he was satisfied to be more with the bunch and not do so much investigating. Besides, he'd got first-hand acquaintance with most all that prowled the range, and everything in general was getting to be less of a puzzle to him. It all kept a-getting to be less of a puzzle to him till finally there come a time when Smoky got so he thought he knowed it all. He figured he had the world by the tail and with a downhill push. Like all the other colts of his age, he was just where conceit had the best of him. He got strong-headed and full of mischief, and then's when the older horses figured him to be a regular pest and began knocking on him. He was getting to be of a size that could stand knocks, too. They all took turns at him and pounded on his ribs every chance they had through the rest of that summer and tried to set him where he belonged. But it was slow work, and Smoky was still getting away with some of the bluffs when the first snows came. He was ornery all that winter, and even though none of the horses would let him steal the grass they pawed up, he aggravated 'em a lot by making 'em think he would. And when they'd kick at him and miss, there was some more about his actions that sure let 'em know he was getting away with something. Then one day a strange horse showed up on the skyline and joined the bunch. A strange horse is always sort of timid when first joining a new bunch that way, and Smoky took advantage of that to show there was at least one he had buffaloed. He run the stranger around and around and kept a nipping him on the rump till the old pony was on the point of leaving and hunt new territory. That sport lasted off and on for a few days, and then one day the older horse turned and lit into Smoky. There was no battle, for Smoky was just running a bluff, and at the first turn of the events he evaporated and kept on evaporating till the stranger got cooled down a bit. After that, Smoky kept his distance and acted willing to let the stranger stay with the bunch. The winter wore on that way, and as Smoky was met hard at every ornery thing he'd do, it all got to finally leave an impression on him, and he gradually lost some of his conceit and hard-headedness. But spring came, other seasons and all kinds of weather followed, and it wasn't till Smoky was a 3-year-old that he really come anywheres living up to good range horse etiquette. There was so much life wrapped up in that pony's hide that it was mighty hard for him to settle down and behave. And even as a 3-year-old he sometimes had to bust out and do things that wasn't at all proper, and which made the old horses set their ears back and show their teeth. The start of Smoky's 3rd year was all to his favor. The spring rains was warmer than on average, the green grass shot up half an inch to the day, and more than met up with the hard-to-satisfy appetite which was his. Consequences is, when he shed off his long winter coat, he was slicker and rounder than ever, and looked like he was wrapped up in fine mouse-colored silk. His blazed face loomed up snow-white and to match his trim ankles. He was a picture to make any cowboy miss a few heartbeats as he sometimes raced across the prairie sod, and with head and tail up showed off the qualities that stuck out at his every move. But to the bunch, all them qualities and good points of Smoky's was lost and not noticed at all. His mammy or any of the others would have thought just as much of him if he was just an ordinary horse or even an ill-built scrub. They'd all liked him better if he wasn't so ornery and didn't need so much convincing. For Smoky was getting to be of a size and temper along with it, where it was mighty hard for some to try educate him and show that they could. His education kept on, though, for there was still a few that packed a convincing hoof. But them few was dwindling down fast, and Smoky was steady getting where he could hold his own with most any of 'em, till finally, and after many showdowns, there came a time when there was only 2 left in the bunch that he couldn't stop and argue with. Them 2 was his mammy and the big buckskin. Smoky felt some superior and mighty proud then for a while, and it's a good thing he was a little wiser and quieter, and not so full of mischief no more, or he'd sure dealt them ponies misery. As it was, he was now willing to leave them alone if they'd do the same by him. Things went on that way for some time, and as the days went by, the bunch was getting to be more willing to accept Smoky as a full-size range horse with brains according. None tried to educate him no more, and if once in a while he showed young blood and some foolishness, they was all careful to overlook it. Of course Smoky was wise enough to keep away from his mammy and the buckskin at them times. Peace was with the little bunch. All had some understanding, and every horse knowed his ground. It was all so peaceful that Smoky felt it, and it all began to wear on him to the point where he felt like tackling the big buckskin, just to start something. Then relief came one day and scattered that peaceful monotony from hell to breakfast. It all happened as the little bunch strung out was heading for water. Smoky's mammy was in the lead as usual, and she was the first to turn the point of a ridge and find herself to within a few yards of a big black stud. Smoky was close second on the sight, and somehow as he snorted at the long-maned, thick-jawed black, a hunch came to him that peace had come to a sudden end. He stood in his tracks kind of doubtful as to what to do, and watched the black cloud of horseflesh. He'd let the stallion make the first false move. Proud as a peacock came the black, mane and tail a-waving and stepping high. His little bunch of mares and colts had stayed back at the first sight of the strange ones, and was now watching the proceedings of the meeting. That meeting impressed the young horses a whole lot. The white of their eyes showed with interest as the stud came up to within a few paces of the new bunch, stopped, and with a powerful neck bowed to a half circle, ears pointed ahead and eyes a-shining, stood and sized up the strangers. He'd had plenty of experience in meeting strange bunches that way before, which all left him kind of cautious. For many a time he'd left quicker than he'd come, and lost some hide to an older stud what was more up to the game of fighting. And he soon learned that it wasn't a wise idea to ram into a strange bunch and go to appropriating mares without first investigating what kind of a leader that bunch had. He'd got wised up in many ways through them meetings, and he learned to be some careful. He'd also learned to handle his hoofs and teeth, till there hadn't been any stud on that range that had been able to whip him the last 3 years. He'd evened up scores. Smoky hadn't moved, and as the stud still kept standing in one spot with no indication of wanting to start anything, he got restless. Pretty soon it came to his mind that the stallion was leery of starting anything. It was a big mistake, but Smoky'd had no way of knowing better. The big buckskin did know better, and if Smoky had noticed, he'd seen him out there on the far side of the bunch and willing to keep neutral. A move from the black stud decided Smoky. He'd stepped close to his mammy, and nostril to nostril was exchanging sniffs with her when she let out a squeal and struck at him, all of which the stallion didn't pay any attention to. But right about then Smoky landed on him, or at him, for his striking front feet and bared sharp teeth missed him just enough to be a clean miss. Smoky had never reckoned with the fighting qualities of a stallion, and he couldn't figure out how it was he'd struck just thin air when he was so sure his enemy had been right there in front of him, and within easy reaching distance. And what's more that puzzled him was that the stallion never offered to show fight when he landed at him so furious. Instead, he'd just got out of the way of his rush, kept his ears ahead, and went on sizing up the bunch the same as if nothing had happened. Smoky felt like he hadn't even been noticed, and the actions of the stud had said plainer than words, "Fool kid." A swift kick in the ribs couldn't have done any better towards putting Smoky down a peg or two, and that simple quick move of the stud's went a long ways to show what could have happened if he'd been in mind to fight. All that left Smoky kinda uncertain as to how to proceed. He didn't know whether to go back and try it again, or let things rest for a spell till another chance showed up. In the meantime, the black stud had found out that there was none in that bunch he'd need to watch. And head down to the ground, ears back, he started cutting out the geldings, keeping the mares and fillies to put in with the bunch he already had. That was a harder job than it might sound here, for none of the geldings wanted to be cut out of the bunch they'd been with for so long. And even though they went out easy enough, they'd turn back as the stud would be cutting out another, and would have to be headed off and cut out again and again. Then the big buckskin, which had been neutral all this time, finally got riled up at being separated from the mares that way, and when the stud headed for him, he stood his ground. A few seconds more, and there was buckskin and black hair a-sailing in the air, then hoofs a-pounding away, which would have kept up with machine-gun fire for speed. Only the pounding wasn't sounding so sharp it was hitting something solid, and there wasn't any misses. Finally, out of the dust that was stirred, there came a streak of buckskin, and right close to it was a streak of black. Away from the herd they went, and pretty soon the black stud came back shaking his head the same as to let every horse know he wasn't going to stand for no foolishness. There was one more to be put out of the bunch. He was that mouse-colored gelding Smoky. He got in while the stud was chasing away the buckskin. He'd stood alongside his mammy and watched the fight, and there was a light in his eyes that showed he was ready to start another battle if it was necessary. But he sure wasn't going to be put out without he was convinced it could be done. He wasn't built that way. The stallion spots him there and never went through no preliminaries nor tried to scare him out with just a look. He dived right into him, and Smoky met him halfways. That battle was short and wicked, and Smoky managed to land some good hard kicks. Kicks that had knocked the wind out of any ordinary horse and sent 'em a-sprawling. But the stallion wasn't no ordinary horse, and them kicks only shook him a little and made him all the madder. He'd fought too many hard battles to let any gelding faze him, and besides, he was in the habit of winning. His chance came when Smoky turned to land a couple more hard ones. The stud was broadside to the gelding, and as the hard ones came, he just reared up out of the reach of 'em, made a big lunge to one side, and coming down, he made a quick grab and fastened his teeth in Smoky's withers. When Smoky pulled away and the stud's teeth snapped together, there was some of his silky hide between 'em. Smoky squealed and kicked some more. Then he whirled and faced the stud, figuring on doing some damage with teeth and front hoofs. Just about then, the stud whirled too and planted his two hind hoofs smack bang into Smoky's ribs. There was an echo which sounded like a steam engine ramming into a stone wall. That echo was followed with a mighty grunt, as Smoky was lifted off his feet and throwed out a ways to a staggering standstill. Smoky was in a daze. His vision was dim, and maybe it was all instinct that warned him of the dark cloud that's turned and was now a-tearing down on him. Anyway, something made him move in a hurry. All the strength that was left in him was used to make distance away from the black devil, which now looked to Smoky like a big centipede. It had so many legs. His life depended in the speed he could make, and Smoky was running like he'd never run before. It seemed like there was no shaking the mad stud, and just when he was on the point of giving in and making a last stand for his life, that destroying hunk of horseflesh left him. When Smoky stopped, looked back, and seen the stud hightail it back to the mares, he had no hankering to follow. He was convinced. The next few days that followed was mighty aimless to Smoky. Him and the big buckskin had formed a partnership in that time, and the two wandered around like they was lost and didn't care where they went. They covered a lot of territory, passed up a lot of good grassy hollows and shady places, but they kept a-drifting on. They grazed as they drifted, and natural-like followed up the canyons and crossed over the high passes that had been the summer range of Smoky's mammy and the bunch. They came across other little bunches, but it seemed like in each of 'em there was a wild-eyed, thick-jawed stud come out ready to kick the daylight out of 'em if any symptoms of them wanting to trail in with the bunch was showed. In their roaming around, they passed other geldings which, like themselves, had been kicked out of the stud bunches. The meeting with them was just plain howdy-doos, and each and all passed on and headed their own wandering way. All would be hunky-dory again for the buckskin if he could find another bunch to run with where there was mares and little colts. He had a mighty strong feeling for the little fellers, and most any bunch would do if there was only a few of them in. But with Smoky, it was his mammy he missed most, his brother, and the other colts he'd growed up with. No other bunch would do as well, and the nicker he'd send echoing across canyons and over ridges every once in a while was just for them certain few. Smoky's mammy had no choice when that black stallion came and scattered them out to his liking that way. She was made to join that little bunch of his, and she knowed better than to try to do different. She knowed she'd only lose some hide in any attempt to get away, and that in the long run she'd have to do as he pointed out. She was wise to the range and the ways of her kind, And even though she was as strong for Smoky as Smoky was for her, she didn't miss him so much as he did her. She felt in a way that he was now big and mighty able to take care of himself. And then there was other youngsters which called for all her attention. But it was different with Smoky. She was his mammy, and there was none other that could take her place. He'd growed up at her side, and even though other little colts had come, she was and always would be the mother he knowed when he was wobblety-legged and needed her. Then one day, and as time had wore on in lonesomeness that way, there came a short break in the monotony which helped Smoky forget some. Him and the buckskin had run across a little bunch of mares. There was some little colts in the bunch and a young stud. The big buckskin sized up the stud the same as he'd sized up all the others he'd met. And as this young feller came up full of pride and confidence to meet the two strangers, the big buckskin found a flaw in him. The flaw was nothing more or less than just youth. He showed it in every move he made and every action. From past experience, the buckskin had figured youth and ignorance to go together, and that's what made it interesting. Interesting by the fact that through youth and ignorance, the young stallion wouldn't maybe be able to compete against the fighting abilities of the buckskin. The younger horse hadn't as yet fought many battles that the buckskin could feel at a glance of him. He didn't turn away like he'd done before. As the stallion came on, he just stood in his tracks and watched him. Smoky was doing the same. There's bowed necks as the three touch nostrils. There's some squealing and striking, and then a kick is planted. The young stud had started things. Smoky had caught the kick, which left him out a ways. In the meantime, the buckskin followed up the lead and went at it from there. It was all a mighty fair exchange from the start. Kicks and bites was averaging pretty well on both parties. And for a young horse, that chestnut stud was sure doing well. All might have come to a draw, and both fighters might have quit about the same time if it hadn't been for Smoky. Smoky, which had got to be pretty thick with the buckskin, and had been a good partner of his through their lonesome roamings, found it mighty natural-like, wanting to help when trouble came that way. Besides, he was holding a grudge against the stud for kicking him the way he did, and all them things together kinda had him worked up to mix in. His chance came as the chestnut whirled to plant a hard one on the buckskin's ribs. There was only a few feet between Smoky and the stud right then, and double action started from there. The stud felt hard-hitting hoofs and teeth a-getting him from both sides, and the punishment he received all at once wouldn't have been worse if he'd a-lit in a stack of wildcats. It was then that it came to his mind and sudden that he should let up on the fighting and start doing some running if he wanted to keep hisself all in one piece. Smoky and the buckskin kept a-pounding on him and a-helping along on the good hunch till finally it was all made mighty plain. The chestnut picked himself up as best and quick as he could and made a leap out of reach of the too many wicked hoofs and teeth, and tore up the earth for a change of scenery. The two partners done their best to escort him on his way. But as that day came to an end, and as the sun passed over and beyond the blue ridges, Smoky and his partner could see a lone horse outlined against the sky. The chestnut was following. He followed 'em and the bunch they'd chased him out of for 3 days. And once he started a fight to win back what he'd lost. He just lost more hide and won nothing but another boost out of that territory. Smoky and the big buckskin had handed him the same medicine another stud had handed them. The days that followed was mighty peaceful to the big buckskin, and Smoky seemed some contented too. He was gradually getting used to being away from his mother, and new young fillies and colts he was running with made it all a heap easier to forget. Then again, the knocks he'd got ever since that day when things had been so peaceful with his mammy, when he just figured he'd have to start something to bust up the monotony of that peace, all took the mischief out of him. The fight with the black stallion, the lonesome ramblings with the buckskin, and the other fights with the chestnut stud all helped educate him and shape him into a full-sized, serious-thinking gelding. It didn't take so much to keep him contented no more, and somehow or other he was seeing a heap more in life. That's the way things stood with Smoky that summer. Him and the buckskin ranged high up in the mountains with the little bunch of mares and colts. They all snoozed and grazed through the days, and done the same through the nights. A little play was brought on once in a while by some of the young colts, and Smoky and the buckskin was always the steady victims of them. Them two older horses was colts themselves at them times, and the way they'd all nip at one another, and then sashay around hell-bent for election, a human would wonder at the care Smoky and the buckskin was taking so that the colts would feel winners in all they'd start. Summer passed. The grass had gradually turned to a yellow-brown, and the leaves of the aspens began banking up on the edges of the streams. Fall had come, and one day the bunch started a grazing steady lower and lower till a few days later the foothills was reached. It was there that Smoky took the lead and headed for the winter range where his mammy had put him through that first year. The big buckskin followed, till glancing back over his withers, he noticed that the mares and colts had left off and branched out another direction. The buckskin stood in his tracks, watched Smoky line out straight ahead, and then looked back at the mares again. For the time being, he wasn't sure whether to go on with his pardner or turn back to the bunch. It was hard for him to decide. He wanted to go with Smoky, and still them little colts sure had a mighty holt on his heartstrings. It was just about as he was doing the hardest figuring when one of them little fellers came out of the bunch a ways and nickered for him. That little nicker decided things for the buckskin. He answered it, and loped back to join with the other little fellers and the mares. Smoky went on straight ahead. Maybe he was thinking strong, thinking that he'd see his mammy again on that winter range. Anyway, it never came to him to look back and see if the bunch was following him. And finally, when it did come to him that he was drifting on alone, he stopped and looked around in a sort of vacant stare. His instinct had been controlling him, and was taking him back to his home range. But when he found himself alone that way, it all left him surprised at first, and then doubtful as to what to do. He was mighty attached to that buckskin, the little colts, and the bunch in general. He looked at the faraway hills of his range, and he seemed like to think on the subject for quite a spell. Then all of a sudden his head went up, a loud nicker went out, and away in the distance he could hear an answer. The answer had come from his pardner, the buckskin. Smoky nickered again and loped back to the bunch. He'd come to feel that it didn't matter so much which range he wintered on. He was a big horse now, and a few ridges to the north or south of that range he was raised in didn't make much difference. An old mare had took the lead, and from then on Smoky just followed side by side with the buckskin. A little colt nipped him in the flanks, and all was well. Chapter 4 of Smoky the Cowhorse, The End of a Rope. Snow laid heavy on the range that winter. Grass was hard to get at, and the little bunch of ponies that tracked the low hills which raised up on the prairies was finding themselves doing a lot of rustling and pawing and getting very little feed. Bunches of cattle followed 'em wherever they went, and rooted with their nose for the few blades of dry grass them horses had pawed the snow off of and left. Hay couldn't be bought that winter, and the stockmen found themselves where they had to take a chance and pull their cattle through with whatever little hay the dry summer before could let 'em have. Cattle had been in fine shape that fall, but as the snow kept a-piling and a-drifting and covering up the feed, the tallow kept a-dwindling away from under the critters' hides, and lean ribs began to show more and more through the long winter hair. Then came a time as the blizzards blowed, and regardless of what all the stockmen done, which was to the limit of what any human can do, when mounds of white begin to show here and there in that part of the range, underneath them white mounds was the dead carcass of a critter. Some was dug up by the varmints. Coyotes was licking their chops, and to make things worse, there appeared 3 big gray wolves on the skyline one day. Smoky and the big buckskin horse was the first to see the wolves. Their ears was towards them as the 3 outlaws of the range trotted along and then stopped to look at the horses. Smoky had never seen a wolf before, but the big old buckskin had seen too many of 'em and had scars to show for his meetings with the kind. He let out a snort at the sight of the 3 gray shapes, and from that Smoky got a hunch that these was more to be reckoned with than the coyotes he'd chased when he was a yearling. He had a hankering to go and give them a chase, too, but the nervous way the buckskin was acting kinda warned him that it'd be best for him to stick with the bunch. The weak and dying cattle is what had really drawed the wolves. Of course, they would just as soon tackle a strong animal as a weak one, but the scent that scattered over the range from the dead stock, and which would reach no less sensitive a nose than theirs, was a lot to their liking, and they'd just drifted in to investigate. It was below them to touch any of the carcasses they'd passed, for these was old wolves well up to the game of killing, and nothing but fresh meat would do. A good fat yearling or 2-year-old colt is what came highest and most to their tastes. And when they skirted that ridge and spotted that little bunch of ponies in the draw below, it was the sight of them that reminded their appetites how long ago it was since they'd et last, and they'd traveled a long ways. But it was still daylight, and according to their natural way of doing things, they'd wait till night come before making the kill. They skirted on and out of sight of the horses, nosed the snow and the air to make sure that the coast was clear, and after another look at the country so they'd know it when they returned, the wolves trotted on. They showed what old-timers they was as they circled well away from the carcass for fear of a trap. They'd had their toes pinched in the steel jaws, scars showed where bullets had grazed 'em, and one was still packing a piece of lead, which a cowboy had fired at him from a long shot with a .30-30. The big buckskin back there in the draw knowed their way, and it showed in his action. He'd quit pawing for grass and instead put all his attention to the tops of the ridge that was all around him and the bunch. The way them 3 wolves had sized up the bunch and then disappeared had made him restless and mighty spooky, and finally that draw got to be too much of a hole for him. Too good a place for an enemy to come into without being seen till that enemy was too close. The older mares showed a lot of spookiness too, which all got Smoky riled up so that he began acting the same. And when the buckskin took the lead out of the draw to where a good look of the country around could be got, the whole bunch was mighty anxious to follow. Even the little colts seemed to have their hunch that something was up. The white of their eyes showed as they stuck mighty close to their mammy's side. A big moon came up, and the light of it reflected a path that shined on the crusted snow. The air was mighty still with the cold that had gripped the range and made everything that lived and carried hoofs come to a stand so that no air would be stirred. A breeze at that temperature would froze stiff every standing animal in that territory. Smoky, the buckskin, and the bunch stood on a knoll where they could see well around 'em. They looked like petrified or froze there, so still they all stood. There was no sign of life from 'em, excepting for an ear that moved once in a while, and which was on the job to catch any sound that might come from near or far. The yip-yip and howl of a coyote was heard, another answered, and pretty soon them 2 filled the air with their serenading. The echo of that hadn't quite died down when the long, drawed-out and mournful howl of a wolf made that of the coyotes seem like a joke. The little bunch of horses on the knoll hadn't blinked an eye while the coyotes was serenading. But at the sound of what followed, every head in the bunch went up, every ear pointed towards the sound, and the buckskin, with a few others, snorted. Restlessness had got in the bunch. Smoky started out a ways and came back. Then pretty soon, and keeping as close together as they could, they all began moving. They moved on like shadows. And like more shadows, 3 gray shapes had took up their trail. The big buckskin had stayed in the rear of the bunch, and he was first to notice the wolves. A loud whistling snort was heard from him as he landed in the middle of the bunch and kettled them into a stampede and the run for their lives. The cold air was split 40 ways, and crusted hunks of snow was sent a-flying as the ponies, all wild-eyed, broke their way through the drifts at the edge of a ridge and run on towards the big flat. Smoky had stampeded with the rest and kept pretty well up in the lead through the run. But now that his blood was warming up in plowing through the deep snow, and being that the blood was circulating more free up his neck and into his brain, it all put somewhat of a different light on the subject. That brain of his was all het up on hair trigger with the waking up the run was giving it, and pretty soon something hatched up in there that made Smoky slow down till the bunch went past and ahead of him. He was wanting to see what was all fired dangerous about them wolves so as to make the bunch run that way. The big buckskin was the last to pass Smoky. He was busy keeping 2 little colts just a few months old from lagging behind too far. Bucking the deep snow at the speed the bunch was making was beginning to show on 'em, and it was taking a lot of persuading from the big horse to keep them little fellers on the move. The wolves was steady catching up with the bunch, and the attack would have took place some sooner if it hadn't been for Smoky. His lagging behind had fooled the wolves into thinking that the mouse-colored gelding had quit and was ready to make his last stand. It had been Smoky's intention to wait for the killers and paw the daylight out of 'em, but as the 3 rushed in on him, he figured it a good idea to postpone the pawing for a while and do a little running till he was some acquainted with their ways and tricks. Head and tail up and fire in his eyes, he lined out and led the wolves away from the bunch. They'd figured on making him their victim on account he was the handiest, but as the chase kept up, they found the gelding had a powerful lot of speed left in him. In the meantime, Smoky had somehow lost all hankering of stopping and fight it out with them. There was something about the 3 hungry-looking creathers that kept him a-moving, and his instinct was warning him strong that he should keep some safe distance between him and them. He was doing that the best he could, and as the running kept up and the wolves couldn't get any closer, they finally figured they was wasting their time. Maybe he got to looking too old and tough for 'em, and calculated they'd rather have younger and more tender meat. Besides, he was leading 'em straight away from the bunch, which might make 'em lose their chances of getting anything at all. Smoky's play of leading the wolves off that way had been a great relief to the bunch, and mostly the young colts. They'd had a chance to slow down some and get their second wind, and when the killers showed up on their trail once again, they was all more able to sashay on and keep from reach of their tearing fangs. When Smoky found that the wolves had left him and turned back towards the bunch, it was his natural instinct to turn too and follow up in their tracks. He had a hunch somehow that he'd be needed there, and he hadn't altogether lost the hope of a chance of taking apart at least one of the outlaws. It was a long and mighty hard run back till he caught up with the bunch again, but Smoky wasn't the horse he was for nothing. He made it in near as good a time as the wolves themselves, and he got there just as the wolves circled around past the buckskin and headed for one of the colts he'd been hazing. The buckskin hadn't hardly been noticed. The wolves had passed him up as too old, especially when there was such as the young colts which could be got easy. The old horse had watched him catch up with the bunch and go past him for a younger victim. He had no way to know that they didn't want him, and he could have kept well in the lead of the bunch if he'd wanted to. But he'd made hisself guardian over the little colts, and he couldn't for the life of him have left 'em behind. Of course the little feller's mammies would have fought for him too, but they was at the stage where they felt every horse was for himself. They'd scared into a stampede, and all was a running for their own lives. The old buckskin knowed wolves. He knowed they had their eye on him, and it was best to keep neutral till they'd got over being watched of every move he'd make. And as the three grays passed him and was gaining on the scared little colts, he kept to one side and watched. It was just as the leader made a leap for one of the little feller's hamstrings that the big buckskin came to life. He made a leap, too, and went to fighting at the risk of his own life. The wolves hadn't looked for no such move from him. They'd got over watching and figured he was far behind and had put all their attention on dragging down the victim they'd picked. It was a mighty big surprise for them when from behind the big buckskin landed on the second wolf and buried him in the snow while on his way to the first. A good-sized hoof came down just as that first wolf turned his head to meet the fighting buckskin. The hoof connected with his lower jaw as he made the turn and left the jaw hanging limp and plumb useless. When the old pony looked back for the other wolves, there was long gray hair sticking between his teeth. It was about then when Smoky arrived on the scene. He'd come up right behind the buckskin, and when the second wolf picked himself up out of the snow and made a grab, which would have been the death of the old horse, Smoky done a side swipe that was quicker than chained lightning. A hind hoof came up and caught that wolf right under a front leg close to the body, and took that leg off him like it had been a toothpick. Another horse that had come up from behind and hadn't been reckoned with. It was during this commotion of biting and kicking mixture of buckskin and mouse-colored horseflesh and flying gray wolves that the third and only able wolf disappeared into thin air. Them two fighting ponies had took away all his appetite for colt meat and left a hankering only to be gone from the reach of their destroying hoofs. 3 of his kind could have competed with the mad ponies if their attention had been on them from the start. But that's where the slip had been made, and as it was, that lone wolf didn't feel at all equal of resuming what the leader of the pack had started. He left. The moon faded away into the sky. Break of day had come. Out on the flat, the little bunch of ponies was knee-deep in the snow and a-pawing away for the grass that was underneath. There wasn't a scratch on nary a hide to show that any had ever seen a wolf. But if Smoky and his pardner, the buckskin, hadn't been in that little bunch, there would have been another story to tell. The little colt, which was so busy digging up feed for himself and plumb ignorant of the close call he'd had, would have been amongst the missing and just easing the appetites of 3 gray wolves. And who knows but what a couple more colts might have been killed along with him, for once a wolf gets a taste of warm blood, there's no telling how far he'll go. The yip-yip and howl of a coyote sounded off from the hills, and gradual as the sun came up, big clouds showed over the skyline from the northwest, and seemed like headed to meet and kill that sun's warm rays. By noon that day a blizzard had come, and the little bunch of ponies faced it on the way back to the shelter of the hills from where they'd left in their run for life. The howl of a lone wolf was heard that night, and away off to the south there came an answer that was more drawed out and mournful than any that had ever been heard. Smoky snorted, but with the buckskin only his head went up, his ears pointed towards the sound. He knowed wolves, and he knowed they wouldn't be back. Not that night. The blizzard hung on for a day and filled the ravines with deep drifts. Then the wind died, and it settled down to a slow-falling snow. There was more white mounds where that snow had covered the carcasses of dead critters. But amongst them mounds there was one that wasn't made by any of the bellering, grass-eating kind. A big gray wolf laid there. A broke jaw had been the cause of his death. Some months later, a cowboy run down and roped a three-legged wolf, and remarked as he looked close to where a front leg was missing, how it must have been an awful wicked bullet to have took that leg off so neat. The already long winter dragged and hung on like it never was going to quit. Snow was deep, and even though the sun climbed higher and stayed longer, there seemed to be no more heat from it than there'd been 2 months before and when it was at its lowest. The ponies was having a hard time, and as the feed kept a-getting to be harder to reach, right along they was steady losing on weight and strength. The roundness that had been theirs a few months before was all gone, and instead they showed lean and slab-sided. Finally, and after it seemed there'd be no end to the rough weather, there came a break. It turned warmer, and some time later the snow began to sag, and then melt on the sunny side of the hills. Gradually, and after what seemed weeks instead of days, the grass showed in plain sight more and more, till the time come when the ponies didn't have to paw for their feed no more. Then, after a while, there was green stems showing through the dry grass. The dangers of the winter was over. The range had turned from white to brown and then green, and the little bunch of ponies began to perk up considerable. The winter hair was a-slipping, their eyes showed more bright, and pretty soon ribs began to disappear under layers of fat and glossy hides. Then, to make this new green world as great and wonderful as the winter before had been hard and cruel, there began to appear brand new little colts in the bunch, all slick little fellers and full of play. And as the bunch drifted to the open prairie, they came across the little calves, their little white faces a-shining in the sun. Smoky had more than kept with all the changes to the good. He showed it in every move he made, and as him and the old buckskin, which had got young again, played around and showed jealous over the new colts, it made a sight that was complete in all that life could give. There was months of peace that way. The little bunch roamed the prairies, not at all seeming to care where sunup found 'em. Tall green feed was a-plenty and everywheres. Clear, swift mountain streams slowed down on the flats and furnished moisture for the big cottonwoods that reached out in the sky and made cool shade. And as it was, time was just let slip by and enjoyed only as a free-range horse with little colts for company can enjoy it. It was more through habit than heat that the little bunch drifted on up the foothills one day and then higher in the mountain. Maybe they liked the breeze up there better, or the change of feed, or maybe it was that too many riders had been showing up off and on, which kinda disturbed 'em. But them riders couldn't be dodged that easy, and one day for a whole half-hour there was one to within a half a mile of 'em, a-setting on his horse, field glasses in his hands, and looking at the little bunch as they fanned themselves on a high ridge, plumb ignorant of the eyes that was on 'em. That rider had spotted the mouse-colored, blaze-faced gelding, and at the sight of him let out a whistle of surprise of seeing such a horse. He'd rode a little closer then, and watched that horse some more. He'd have come still closer, only he didn't want to kettle the bunch and make 'em suspicious. Besides, he'd just wanted to locate where that horse was running so he'd know where to find him when he wanted to. He was one of the Rocking R men. Smoky had stood the whole watchful spell without a hunch of it, And as him and the little bunch started a-grazing on up the mountain, there was nothing further away from his mind than the thought of a human on his trail. Of course, there wasn't any human on his trail that day, but there would be soon, for the way that rider talked that night and described Smoky to the bronco buster of the outfit all indicated that it wouldn't be long when the little horse would be finding himself in a high pole corral. Smoky was now a 4-year-old going on 5, the age when most all range geldings are run in and broke to either saddle or harness, for use on the range or to fit 'em for market. The little horse had had a good long time of freedom, and if he was kept with the outfit he'd get more, but his time for usefulness had come. The free roaming of the hills and flats was past for a while till the work he'd been cut out for was done, and Smoky's experiences from his colt days on till now would go on with more learning and experiences with the human. Smoky's waking up to realizing them things came sudden and almighty unexpected. A long-legged rider on a long-legged horse had showed up on a ridge above him and the bunch. There'd been a lot of territory covered in a mighty fast time, as all lit into a run, and they was hazed down onto the flats and then into long pole wings towards the corral. Then first thing Smoky knowed, he was penned in and couldn't go no further. A big gate was closed, and all around him was big cottonwood bars. In another pen joining the one Smoky was in, there was other horses, all geldings and along about Smoky's size and age. The gate between was opened, and Smoky was cut out of his bunch by that same long-legged rider that had run him in, and put through that gate to join them other geldings. The gate was closed again after him. Smoky peeked through the bars and watched the rider open the outside gate and leave out the bunch he'd run with. He watched one of the mares take the lead and in a long lope head back to the high territory from where they'd come. He watched the little colts running to keep up, and then he seen the big buckskin tagging along. His pardner and all was leaving him amongst strange horses in a high corral, and not far away was a human which to Smoky was 10 times worse than any wolf. He nickered, and there was a sound to it that made the buckskin stop, look back, and nicker and answer. The old horse stood there a while, kinda like he was waiting, but pretty soon he started again and caught up with the bunch. The old buckskin knowed humans. He'd packed many a one of 'em on many a long ride. His freedom had been handed back to him for the good work he'd done. He'd experienced what Smoky was going through now, and knowing what he did, it was all plain to him just what was up. There was no use of him waiting. Smoky watched him and the bunch disappear in a cloud of dust and out of sight. If only there was no bars holding him, it wouldn't take him long, and he could still catch up with 'em, but he was brought back to hard facts by the squeak of the heavy gate as it was pulled open, and the cowboy walked in with a long coil of rope on his arm. Smoky let out a snort at the sight of the human, and tore up the earth for the far side of the corral. Natural fear of the creature had a hold on him, and once against the solid bars he turned and quivering faced what he felt was his worst enemy. If Smoky could only knowed, there'd been a lot of suffering which he wouldn't had to have went through on account of that fear. If he'd only knowed that right then that human was just admiring him for all he was worth, and that doing the little horse any harm was the furthest thing away from his mind. But the wild gelding had no way of knowing, and every word that human was saying sounded to him like the growl of a flesh-tearing animal, and every move was a step closer to the victim. He was the victim. The cowboy well understood his kind. He'd been raised on the backs of such as him, and he was making his living by gentling that kind and making good saddle horses out of 'em. And as he stood there, his eyes taking in every move the mouse-colored gelding was making, there was a smile showed under the Stetson. That smile was just for the glad way he felt as he sized him up and seen where he was all saddle horse. Not the kind that'd fit in harness and to be shipped to farming countries. He was glad to know that he'd be the first to touch that pony's hide, and as he kept his eye on the gelding, at the same time shaking out a loop, he felt there'd be no end of patience for such a horse as that one looked to be. His loop ready, he walked towards the gelding. Smoky watched him come, and that pony's actions showed where he just wanted to shrink away to nothing and disappear. But he stayed full size and seen where his next best move was to just move, and away to most any old place. The other geldings scattered as the human came on, and Smoky piled in amongst 'em full speed to the other side of the corral. About that time he heard the hiss of a rope, and that thing which he likened to a snake coiled up and right around both his front feet. Them front feet was jerked away from under him as he sailed in the air and tried to get away. And then he made a circle in the atmosphere and came down to earth flat on his side. He no more than hit the ground when he tried to get up. He tried it again and again, and as the cowboy talked to him and advised him to ease up on the fighting, Smoky turned a wild-eyed look his way and snorted. "Now lay down and be good," says that cowboy. "I sure don't want to skin up that pretty hide of yours." Smoky did lay down. He had to, for in another few seconds his 4 feet was tied together. He breathed hard as he laid there plumb helpless. His mind wasn't working no more. His heart was a thumping fit to bust, and the racing of the blood through his body only stampeded his brain. He was past trying to figure out how he was throwed so easy and then held down where he could move only his head. No cougar or bear could have made him so helpless. He could have fought with them, but with this human it all seemed like he had no chance, and the mystery of that human's power is what put the fear in him. The fear the likes of which was a heap worse than he'd felt if he'd been cornered by 1,000 bears, cougars, and wolves. In a dazed way he seen the cowboy bend over him. A knee touched his neck, and the muscles along there quivered the same as if a snake's fangs had been feeling for a holt. A hand touched his ear and another his forehead. There was no pain, but if there had been, the little horse would have never felt it. Pretty soon a hackamore was slipped on his head. He felt the rawhide bozal around his nose, and then the fetter rope around his neck. All the while the creether was making a low and somehow not aggravating noise. It was a talking to him. The cowboy gave his forehead a couple of rubs, then stood up and walked around to the pony's feet. Smoky felt the tight ropes loosening up from around his ankles and pulled away. His feet was free, but his mind was confused a lot, and he still laid there. Then he felt a pull on the hackamore rope. "Come on up and stand on your legs," says that cowboy, and Smoky came to life. He came to life a-pawing and rearing and a-snorting. His feet was free, and he could handle 'em again. He did handle 'em, and put in all the strength and action he had a-trying to pull away from the cowboy which was holding him with a long rope. There's some talk of the skill that's showed between the angler and the trout. But the skill that was brought out from that 150-pound cowboy a-holding that 1,100 pounds of kinky wild horseflesh was past talking about, and beyond the figuring out of any human that's not up to the trade of bronco busting. The cowboy played his rope and held his horse. He'd held many like him before, and most all had fought the same as Smoky was now fighting. That pony's eyes was afire as he seen there was no chance for any getaway even when he was on his feet. He couldn't at all shake that two-legged hunk of terror, and as he snorted and fought the rope that still held fast around his head and neck, he began to tire some. And came a time when, as the cowboy stood still a few yards away, he stood still too, and legs wide apart, sweat a-dripping from his slick hide, he took in a breathing spell. He stood there as he watched the cowboy back away and let the rope slide through his hands. He watched him open the gate and get the saddle horse that had been left to stand on the other side. Seen him get on that horse and pick up the slack of the rope that was holding him. There was 30 feet of it between him and the mounted human, and when the rope was tossed a little as the rider circled around him, Smoky made a leap, and shaking his head like trying to slip what held him, he headed straight on for the open gate. But once past it, Smoky was jerked to a fighting standstill. He hadn't as yet reckoned that a rope could hold him. The gate was closed after him, and the rider went through, and then Smoky felt some slack. He took advantage of that and started out full speed again. He was out of the corral and out in the open. The rope that was still on him was only felt and wasn't holding him from lining out. A shallow creek bottom full of tall green feed was by that corral, and Smoky headed down it. Any place would do so long as he could run and keep a distance between him and that rider. But that run wasn't to last long. Once again he felt the rope tighten till he was brought to a stop, and facing the rider once more, watched him get off his horse and fasten the end of the long rope to a log. "Well, little horse," says the cowboy as he stood there and watched him for a spell, "don't play too rough with this rope. The better you treat it, the better it'll treat you." And with that he got on his horse and rode off towards the corrals, where more broncs waited for the same education that Smoky had just got. That long, soft, and thick cotton rope and that log which held Smoky was the means of his first learnings as to ways for usefulness to the human. The more he'd fight that rope and try to get away from it, the more he'd learn that his fighting and tearing was of no use. That rope was on the job steady, and to learn him to turn as he run and hit the end of it, it would take the stiffness out of his neck, and there'd come a time when he'd give to a pull from either side without fighting and wanting to be convinced that it could be done. The log which the rope was tied to was part of the teaching apparatus, heavy enough to hold the pony, and even though it could be dragged around some, Smoky couldn't get very far with it. The little horse realized somehow, as he sized up the contraption, that the end had come to all he'd enjoyed with the freedom he'd had. Cool shades, clear streams, and grassy ranges to all roam on as he pleased had been took away from him. He didn't know what was to come next, but he did know that he was on that creek bottom close to corrals and there to stay for a spell. Chapter 5 of Smoky the Cowhorse. The Bronc Twister Steps Up. A cloud of dust was hanging on over the big corrals where Clint, the bronc twister of the Rocking R outfit, was busy starting raw broncs under the saddle and twisted 'em in shape for good saddle stock. It was long, hot, and hard days for that cowboy as he wrestled with the slick, fat, and snorty ponies and convinced 'em that they all could be led, rode, and handled according to the way he seen fit. But Clint was used to that. He'd been at it for years with nary a rest or relief from the work that was beginning to tell on him. He'd take 10 broncs at a time, and soon as he'd took the rough off them 10, he'd turn 'em over as broke and run in 10 more raw wild ponies. Each green colt was rode every day, if even only for half an hour, and gradually learned to behave under the saddle. There was a few that wouldn't learn to behave, But the rocking our outfit had good men, and all them ponies was put into their work whether they was good or bad. Clint had been with the layout for near 2 years, and in that time had broke to ride somewheres around 80 head of horses. He'd broke many more for other outfits and never made an outlaw. If one did turn outlaw once in a while, it was because of that pony's natural instinct to be that way. But Clint handled and rode 'em all just the same. If a particular horse couldn't be learned, it sure wasn't his fault, and none had better try to learn that same horse anything. As has been said before, bronc fighting was beginning to tell on Clint. None of them ponies he'd broke had spared him, and instead they'd called on for all that was in him. Many had tried to tear him apart and scatter him in the dust of the big corrals. Hoofs had come like greased lightning and took hunks off his back wing chaps. Teeth had took a few shirts off his back, and as he climbed on one after another of these wild, kinky ponies, they most all tried to see if they could move the heart of him from one side of his body to the other. There was many times when he was laid up with dislocated shoulders, ribs broke, and legs the same. From the root of his hair to the toes in his made-to-order boots, there was signs. If not seen, they was felt, where some horse had twisted, broke, or shook something loose. Each happening had come more or less separate and healed some in time. But as some kept a repeating off and on, there was some parts of him which never got strong again. And as time went on, and as Clint said, he was beginning to feel loose like an old clock, and figured that some day some bucking hunk of horseflesh would take the tick out of him and scatter him out so that none of the parts could never be found again. Clint had started riding rough ones long before he quit growing, and that's the condition he was in at 30, an old man, far as riding was concerned. The horses of the same big outfit he'd rode for was worked on the average of only 4 months in the year, and in them 4 months, the broke horses was rode only 4 or 5 hours once every 3 days. That might show some of the difference in the work the cowboy and the cow horse does with a real cow outfit. The men go to pieces young and early, and the ponies stay fat. But there was no grudge, for there's nobody in the world likes to see and ride a fat, strong horse more than does the cowboy. They'll keep the ponies fat and feeling good, and some of them horses find it hard to behave and will try to jar loose the eye teeth of their riders. The cowboy wants 'em that way, though. It's a pride of his to have a kinky horse under him that's feeling good, rather than some gentle old plug that's leg-weary. That all gets him in time, but there's a grin on his face when that time comes, a grin from the pride of knowing that he never was seen on no horse that was against the principle of a cowboy to ride. Like with Clint, horses was the life of him. He loved 'em for all he was worth, and the greatest pleasure in the world for him was in just being with a corral full of 'em, handling 'em and feeling of their hides. The satisfaction he'd get out of seeing some 4-year-old colt learn the things he'd teach meant a heap more to him than the wages he drawed for that work. And there was times as he'd be breaking some right brainy gelding and watch the horse pick up fast on the education he'd give him, when he'd feel real attached to that pony. He'd hate to give him up when the time came for all half-broke horses to be turned over to the roundup wagons, and where more teaching in the handling of the critter began. "I feel sort of married to them kind of ponies," he'd say, "and I sure don't hanker to part with them just when we're beginning to get along good together. But," he'd go on, "I guess as long as I'll be breaking horses this way, I can't get too sensitive." But Clint kept a being sensitive that way, and he never was happy when he'd see riders coming in on him and then ride away hazing a bunch of the broncs he'd started. Some day he was heard to say once. "I'm going to meet a horse I'll really get married to, and then there'll be things a-popping." Clint would have such a liking for some of them ponies that he'd forget and didn't want to think that they belonged to the company and not to him. He was just hired to break 'em. He'd reasoned that out often, but that reasoning never phased the hankering he felt, and that's how come when he run in the mouse-colored gelding, he began to do some tall figuring. He had a hunch when he first set eyes on that pony that he'd met the horse which would start things a-popping when any rider showed up to claim all that's half broke. Clint had dreamed of such a horse as the mouse-colored gelding, but he'd never expected to see one really living. That pony had got holt of his heartstrings from the start, and as he watched through the bars of the corral out to where the horse was picketed, he felt him to be the kind he'd steal if he couldn't buy. And if he could neither steal nor buy, he'd work for. It had been 2 days since he'd run him in and put him on the picket rope outside the corral a ways. And in them 2 days, Clint had been mighty fearful lest somebody rode up on him, seen the horse, and took possession of him as private saddle stock for the superintendent or some other what owned shares in the outfit and liked pretty horses that way. Clint wanted that horse mighty bad, and he was just leery something would happen so he'd be took away from him. But as he'd reasoned some, he was less worried, and he'd wind up by saying, as he'd take another peek towards the gelding, "They'd have to let me break him first, and before anybody else gets him, I'll sure make an outlaw out of that horse." That was no way for Clint to feel, maybe, but that's just sure enough the way he figured on doing rather than lose the horse to anybody else. That feeling was past skin deep with him, and that, I think, excuses him some. In the 2 days that Clint had had the horse up, there was no chance passed where he could show his feelings and win the pony's confidence. If the picket rope tangled him up too much, Clint was right there to untangle him, and each time the gelding fought less when he came. That pony was gradually losing his fear of being et up or tore apart by the human, and pretty soon he felt as Clint came and went that each visit from that creature brought some comfort in a way. It was on the second evening, and when the day's work was all done, that Clint made his way from the bunkhouse to where the gelding was picketed. He went up to within a rope's length of the horse, rolled a smoke, and stood there watching him. "Smoky," he says, "you're some horse." Clint hadn't hardly realized he'd spoke a name. He was too busy watching and admiring that pony's every move. So as it was, that name came unconscious-like to the cowboy, and it was used and repeated from then on as natural as though that name had been thought and decided on. He'd named many horses, and had always let the name come to him either by the color, size, or shape of each horse, and sometimes by the way they acted. He'd called one tall, rangy horse Shorty, and another low-built, small horse Sky High. Often the name didn't at all fit the horse in that way, but there was some reason there. The same as there was a mighty good reason to call the mouse-colored gelding Smoky. He did look like a rounded, shiny cloud of gray smoke, and as he held his ground and watched the cowboy, he acted as though he might live up to his name and really go up in smoke. His acquaintance with the human hadn't been very long, and he wasn't as yet any too confident. Clint could tell as he watched just what was going on in that pony's think tank. He could still see fear in his eyes, but mixed in with that fear was a lot of nerve that showed fight. He knowed that pony would fight and make himself hard to handle, and he'd have been mighty disappointed not to have seen them signs in the horse. It was only natural that any of his kind should act this way, and he figured the wilder the spirit, the bigger and more worthwhile would the winning be. He would take his time, do a good job, and turn Smoky from a raw wild bronc into a well-broke and educated cow-horse. He took a few steps closer, and Smoky backed away to the end of the rope. He snorted when he found he couldn't back no further, and pawed at the rope as the cowboy kept a-coming still closer and closer. Clint took his time, but came on steady and a-talking the while till he finally got within a couple of feet of the horse and where he could touch him. Hanging on to the rope with the right hand, he reached out with the left and touched him easy between the eyes. Smoky flinched and snorted, but he stood it. He stood it for quite a spell, and felt the hand rubbing on his forehead and working up and up towards his ears. Clint had just about got to one of them ears when Smoky rubbed his nose along the cowboy's sleeve, took a sniff, and then of a sudden nipped him on the arm. That had happened to him before many a time, and he'd been ready for it, with the result that the pony got only a piece of shirt and no flesh. "Now, don't be so doggoned ornery," says that cowboy as he kept a-rubbing the same as though nothing had happened. "I only want to reach between them ears and touch that knowledge bump of yours." Finally he did reach the bump and rubbed around there for a spell. Smoky struck once. Clint dodged the front hoof and kept a-rubbing. He rubbed past the left ear and down his neck till the withers was reached. The mane was worked on and all the knots in it untangled. The little horse quivered and flinched every once in a while, but the rubbing process went on till Smoky began showing symptoms that he could stand it all easy enough. In the meantime, Clint talked to him like he'd never took time to talk to another horse before. And if Smoky could have understood, he'd knowed by that talk just what was ahead of him. But Smoky wasn't thinking on what was ahead. The present had him worried enough as it was, and he was kept busy watching every move that human was making. Smoky had lost considerable wildness during the 2 days on the picket rope. He'd learned there was no use in fighting the rope that held him, that it was best to turn when he came to the end of it, and gradually he was getting used to having that rope touch him here and there, and he'd quit kicking at it. He was more familiar with that than with the human who put him there, but the rope done the trick of getting him used to having anything touch him. It kind of broke him to stand the touch of the hand. He was learning to stand that well enough too, but the movements of that hand had to be just right, not too quick and no jabbing done, or there'd be a scattering of something mighty quick. "I'm sure making a lot of fuss over you," says Clint as he rubs on past the withers and along his back a ways. "If you was just an ordinary bronc, you'd be missing most of this attention, and you'd be finding yourself in the corral with me on top of you by tomorrow, and turned in the remuda by another month. But I got a scheme up on account of me liking you the way I do. I'm going to take my time and make you my private top horse, and when that's done, I'll have every cowboy in the country jealous of me for having such a horse as you're going to turn out to be." With Clint's scheming that way, there was a good chance of him winning out, and gradually, steady, the education of Smoky started in. That cowboy called on for all he knowed in the profession of horse-breaking, and used it all with a lot of time to shape out Smoky the way he wanted him. No company time was used on the horse on account Clint felt it wouldn't be doing the square thing. "'Cause," as he says, "it'll be bad enough if I have to steal him." Of course Clint wouldn't steal that horse, or no other one, but he felt like he'd sure do something out of the ordinary rather than let Smoky go to any other rider. Every evening after that last meal of the day was over, Clint would be down in the creek bottom with Smoky. What went on there showed some of what Clint really thought of the mouse-colored gelding, and there was no disappointed look on his face when dark made him return to the bunkhouse. Smoky had been on the picket rope about a week. In that time, Clint had kept his eye on him through the day while working in the corral and spent a couple of hours with him every evening. The little horse had got used to the rope and wouldn't pay no attention to it no more. But as for the cowboy, he was just neutral. It was hard for him to shed off the fear of the human and which he'd inherited. That human was still a mighty big mystery to him even after a week's acquaintance. It had done him no harm, but his wild instinct kept a-warning him to expect most anything. The power that two-legged creature had over him kept him leery and watching for the next move, whatever that would be. And that's why Smoky was still neutral. His confidence for the human hadn't come to the top as yet, and not a move did that cowboy make which he didn't see. "You sure got your eye on me, ain't you, little horse?" Clint would say. "But that's the way I want you to be," he'd go on. "For the more you watch, the more you'll see, and the quicker you'll learn." Smoky did watch and see and learn. And then one evening, Clint untied the long picket rope from the log and started leading him towards the corral. The little horse was broke to lead by then, and he followed easy enough. His heart was a-thumping in wonder of what was due to happen as the cowboy led him through the big pole gate. He stepped high and careful, and his eyes took in everything that looked suspicious. A slicker hanging over one side of the corral made him snort and try to pull away. Clint talked to him and kept on leading him through another gate into another smaller and round corral. A big snubbing post stuck up in the center of it, and by that post was a big brown and shiny hunk of leather. It was Clint's saddle. "Well now, little horse, the performance is about to begin. You're going to get your first smell of saddle leather." Clint had turned as he spoke and began rubbing on Smoky's forehead. For once since Smoky had been caught, his attention wasn't on the cowboy. That hunk of leather was drawing all his interest, and ears pointed straight at it, eyes a-shining. He snorted his suspicions and dislike for the looks of the contraption that was laying there, waiting, it seemed like, to jump at him and eat him alive. "Look, snort and paw at it all you want," says the cowboy. "You'll get well acquainted with it before you get through, and I won't rush the acquaintance either." Clint didn't. He kept Smoky to within a few feet of the saddle, and grinning some at the pony's actions, kept rubbing him back of the ears while the investigation was going on. Smoky was for getting away from there, but Clint was persuading him to stick around close, and there was nothing for him to do but just that. A move from the direction of that saddle right then would have queered things and made Smoky scatter. And Clint couldn't have held him either for a ways, but the hunk of leather laid still, mighty still, and pretty soon it kind-o' lost its dangerous look to the little horse. He began looking around for other things in that corral which wouldn't be to his liking, and not seeing anything that was worth getting spooky at, Smoky began watching the cowboy again. It was about then that Clint reached over and picked up the saddle, slow and easy, and drug it closer to Smoky. At the first move of the riggin', the little horse snorted and backed away. But Clint and the saddle kept a-comin' straight towards him, slow but steady. One side of the high corral finally was reached. Smoky had backed against it and couldn't go no further. The cowboy, still hanging onto the rope that held his head, came on, saddle and all with him, and quivering with fear the little horse laid low. Feet straight out in front and head near to the ground, he stayed there, and got another and different education with the saddle. This time it was dragging. When Clint thought that had gone far enough and seen where Smoky had got over the worst of his fear, he laid the saddle down again, and picking up an old saddle blanket, he began fanning the air with it. Closer and closer to Smoky came the blanket, as the fanning motion kept on, and starry-eyed the little horse watched. He struck at it and snorted a couple times, and he even tried to turn and kick, but the blanket came on till finally one corner of it grazed his side. He flinched and kicked and tried to jerk away, but there was no dodging that spooky-looking thing. Not a word was heard from the cowboy as the sacking went on. This was a part of the education that was necessary, and which should be put through mighty quiet. It was all a spooky enough performance to a raw bronc without adding on any talking, and even though the goings-on scared the pony near out of his hide, that blanket done the trick of showing him that no matter how bad it looked, it wasn't going to hurt him. It was one mighty good thing to teach him general confidence in the cowboy and his riggin'. Smoky fought like a cornered wolf and tried to get away, but he had no chance. Clint had sacked many a bronc that had fought as much, and the cigarette between his lips noticed no change of spells between puffs. Smoky showed hate and fear of the human once again, the same as when he was first caught. His instinct had warned him to expect most anything from that creature, and he wasn't surprised at the way things had turned. But that didn't help any. He just wanted to sail clear over the corral and disappear. Through all that fighting and goings-on, the sacking kept up in steady motion. Wherever the long blanket touched Smoky, he flinched and kicked at it and squealed. He was too scared to realize that there was no sting or any kind of a hurt felt. It was just the looks of the thing which had him going, and his fighting instinct just had to answer every swish of that thing that circled around a leg one time and his neck the next. Finally, and whether it was from being tired or fighting, or that he was dazed past caring of what was going on, Smoky began to let up. His kicks began to get less wicked, and his eyes lost some of the fiery look, till came a time when he stood near still, and he'd only flinch as the blanket kept a-touching, going away, and touching him here and there and all over. Clint, noticing the little horse calming down, remarked, "You'll get so you'll like it pretty soon." But Smoky wasn't showing no such symptom as yet. He was just standing as best he could, and that was all. Both sides and all around Smoky went Clint with his blanket, till the little horse finally even quit flinching. The cowboy then dropped the rope that was holding the horse and worked his blanket wilder than ever. That blanket was laid everywhere on that pony's hide and around his legs. He laid it on the ground and drug it under him, and all Smoky would do was to cock one ear and watch it, but he never moved. A half an hour before, such a play would have sent him straight up. Clint worked on for a while longer, till he was sure there wasn't a spot on that pony that'd flinch at the feel of the blanket. Then he began to notice that Smoky was finally getting so he kind of liked the performance. No flies could touch him while that was going on, and that blanket being pulled all over him that way seemed to kind of soothe some. It was about when Clint figured he could do no more good in the way of sacking that he picked up his saddle again and came straight towards Smoky with it. The squeak of the riggin brought some interest from the horse, but Clint was careful to bring the old blanket with him and keep a fanning the same as to let him know that one was no worse than the other. In the first saddling of most broncs, Clint generally tied up one of their hind legs so as to hinder him from kicking the saddle out of his hands, and at the same time learn him to stand still while that went on. A few of 'em he'd just hobble in the front. And being that Smoky'd had more teaching than the average colt generally gets before first saddling, Clint figured that just hobbling his front feet would do. The sacking had helped a lot, and Clint had no trouble fastening the rawhide hobbles around Smoky's ankles. The pony snorted at him a little, but stood still, for Clint was waving that blanket around as he worked. Once the hobbles was on, he picked up his saddle and eased it up and on that pony's back. Smoky had a hunch that something new was going on, something different than the sacking performance which he'd just went through. But as nothing happened outside of the flapping of stirrup leathers and cinches, he stood in one spot. Only a quiver in the muscles along his shoulder showed how much alive he was, and how quick he could leave the earth if anything goosed him. Plenty of practice had made Clint past master at putting a saddle on a green colt. Nothing happened to make Smoky want to move out of his tracks, and even when the cinch was reached for and drawed up under his belly, he never batted an eye. The sacking had all been a mighty fine preliminary for all this that followed, and cured the horse from scaring at everything that flapped on around him. As it was, Smoky hardly realized that he was saddled till Clint took the hobbles off his front feet and pulled him to one side. At that pull he felt something fastened to him and hanging on. That was a new kind of feeling to Smoky, and it kettled him. Down went his head, and he lit into bucking. Clint had expected that, for no bronc likes the feel of the cinch, no matter how loose it might be. And when Smoky bogged his head that way, he was ready. He let the hackamore rope slide through his hands for a ways and till he could get a good footing. Then he give that rope a little flip and set down on it. That done the trick, and it come doggone near upsetting the little horse. But Clint let out just enough slack, and that saved him. He didn't want to throw the horse, but then he didn't want to have that horse buck with an empty saddle either. "Now, Smoky," says that cowboy as the horse jerked to his senses, turned and faced him, "I don't want you to waste any of your energy that way. If you want to do any bucking, you just wait till I get in the middle of you." Smoky waited, but it wasn't through the talk the cowboy had handed him that he did wait. It was that he remembered how that rope had upset him that first day he was picketed to the log outside the corral, and he wasn't hankering to be busted that way again. There's folks that read some on how horses are broke on the range, and from that reading they get the idea that the cowboy breaks the horse's spirit, that it's the only way a wild horse can be tamed. What I've got to say on the subject, if that's what's believed, is that either them folks read something that's mighty wrong, or else they got the wrong impression and misunderstood what they read. And breaking a horse the way he's broke on the range is about the same on the animal as schooling is to the human youngster. The spirit of the wild horse is the same after years of riding as it was before he ever felt a rope. And there's no human in the world wants to preserve that spirit in the horse like the cowboy does. He's the one what knows better than anybody else that a horse with a broken spirit is no horse at all. To them that only sees a wild horse roped and rode and don't know the insides of the game, horse breaking might seem a little rough. But I'm here to say that it's not near as rough as it is necessary, and in the long run, it's the rider that gets treated the roughest. You let a wild horse get away with something once, and he'll try it again till there will come a time when even if there's no meanness in him, he'll develop some. That's what makes outlaws. Outlaws are made mostly when a horse proves too much for the man that handles him. A wild horse will turn outlaw often if handled by any other than them that knows his kind, and there'll be no way of breaking him, only through starvation and abuse. His spirit would be broken then too, and that proves that the cowboy, knowing his business, will see that the pony's heart is kept intact. There's a variety in horse minds as big as there is amongst human minds. Some need more persuading than others, and a few of 'em, no matter how firm they're handled, will have to be showed again and again that they can't get away with this or with that. They'll keep on a-trying, and if ever once they do put a bluff through, there's most generally enough meanness in their system to make 'em plumb worthless. And like I was saying with Smoky, he remembered how that rope had upset him that first day he was picketed to that log outside the corral, and he wasn't hankering to be busted that way again. That little horse had brains. If he was convinced a few times, he had the sense to realize it, but at the same time he had to be showed, and more because it was part of his necessary education than because of any meanness of his. He was willing to learn, but the teaching had to come from one who could teach him. There was no meanness in Smoky, not an ounce of it. He was honest, clear and through, but meanness would develop if a slip was made. He fought and bit and kicked, but Smoky was a wild horse, and he was going only according to his instinct, and more to protect himself from the strange human. That's the caliber of most range horses. Clint had handled many of 'em, and always won out with their confidence, and turned 'em over as broke with their spirit intact. He'd savvied Smoky the minute he dabbed his rope on him the first time. That pony was wild, wild as a horse or any animal can get, and he had the strength to go with it. But Clint seen where that little horse also had a mighty fine set of brains between them little pointed ears of his. He treated him like a grown-up would treat a kid of the kind that'd learn a lot if the chance showed up, and he missed no chance to show that pony all he should know and how good he wanted him to be. "Doggone it, Smoky," he'd say. "It's too bad you can't know without I have to use a lot of ropes as it is sometimes. I bet you don't think I'm a friend of yours, none at all." Clint was right. At first Smoky had took him as an enemy and fought him according. Then had come a time when he was willing to trust him some, especially when Clint had come and untangled him out of that long picket rope, talked to him and rubbed his ears. His heart had got over thumping so much when he'd see the cowboy come of evenings, and even though the little horse didn't realize it as yet, he'd got to expecting him. Then, and just about when his liking for the cowboy was coming to the top fast, something happened that'd make him wonder for a spell if that cowboy was a friend or still an enemy. The sacking he'd went through in the corral had sort of jarred the confidence that'd begin to sprout for the bow-legged creether, and then the way his head was jerked up out of his bucking spell with the empty saddle. All had left him puzzled as to whether to start in and do some fighting, or else be good and take his medicine. Smoky had no way of knowing as yet what was expected of him, and it was a ticklish time for him. It was right then that he'd have to be handled just right, and when the turning point for the good or the bad would be decided on. But Clint knowed how the turn to the good laid, and it was right there that he proceeded to bring it out. There was only one way to it, and that was for Clint to show Smoky he had to be good. The cowboy knowed Smoky had brains aplenty to realize once he was showed that he had to do just what he wanted him to do. That, of course, would take a little time. The pony would fight some more and wanted to be showed, and to keep him from getting frustrated, that horse would have to have his own way some. Chapter 6 of Smoky the Cowhorse. The Squeak of Leather. 20 feet of rope is laying between the cowboy's hand and the pony's head. The cowboy is standing there, just watching and smiling some at the surprised look that's in the pony's face. That pony had just been stopped sudden in his bucking with an empty saddle. It was the first time a saddle had been on his slick back, and it was no wonder he tried to get out from under that thing. Nothing had ever clung there before. "Now you just take it easy for a spell and keep your head up. says that cowboy as he started walking towards the pony. Legs wide apart, a wild look in his eyes, and a snorting his surprise, Smoky watched him come. He didn't know whether to stand his ground and start fighting or back away as the cowboy came. On he came, and as Smoky was seeing no signs of harm, he stood in his tracks, watched, and waited. A hand touched him on the forehead and moved on down his neck. The cowboy was a-talking to him the while, and pretty soon Smoky's heart wasn't thumping so hard no more. He was then led a little ways, and as he heard the squeak of leather and felt the weight of the saddle with each step he took, an awful hankering came to him to put his head down and try to buck it off. But the cowboy was right there in front of him, and he didn't want to be stopped again and so sudden as he'd been stopped that first time. The other side of the corral was reached, and there Clint turned and rubbed Smoky on the ear. "Well, old boy, let's see how you're going to behave when I get up in the middle of you." Smoky watched the man reach for the latigo and felt the cinch tighten up. A hump came in his back, and which made the saddle set near on end. It was the hump that carried the punch in the buck, and most likely Clint could have led the pony around some till the hump wore down and his back straightened up again. But that rider wasn't for taking the buck out of a bronc too quick. He believed a good sensible horse should buck at the first few settings, and he wasn't the kind of rider that'd smother that natural feeling and have it come out later when the horse is supposed to be broke gentle. He let the hump be and never moved the pony out of his tracks. He knowed that just one move would be enough to start that pony to exploding, and Smoky was set and just a-waiting for that signal to start. He watched the cowboy raise his chaps so the belt wouldn't hinder his leg action, watched him pull his hat brim down solid, and then he couldn't watch no more. Something had come between him and his vision. It was the cowboy's thumb, which had laid over his left eyelid and pulled it down over his eye. In the next second he felt a weight added on to that of the saddle, and all of a sudden he could see again. But what he did see left him starry-eyed and paralyzed. For half a minute he just stood like petrified. That cowboy had disappeared from the side of him, and instead there he was right in the middle of his back, and on that hunk of leather he'd been hankering to shed off ever since it was put on there. Instinct pointed out only one way for him to act. It was telling him that neither the human nor the leather belonged up there in the middle of him that way, and that if he tried he could most likely get rid of 'em. There was nothing else to do that he could see, and right then he felt that he sure must do something. His head went down, and a beller came up out of him that said as much as, "I want you." Up went Smoky's withers, followed by the hump that made the saddle twist like on a pivot, and last came steel muscles like shot out of the earth, and which carried the whole mixed up and crooked conglomeration of man and horse up in mid-air and seemed like to shake there for a spell before coming down. All seemed heads and tails and made a picture of the kind that was mighty hard to see and still harder to figure out. Saddle strings was a-popping like on a whiplash. Leather was a-squeaking. Corrals shook as the hard-hitting hoofs of the pony hit the earth, and a dust was stirred that looked like a young cloud. Smoky was scared, mad, and desperate. All the action, strength, and endurance that was in him was brought out to do its best. Not a hair on his hide was laying idle through the performance. Every muscle tightened and loosened in a way to shake the weight on his back and make it pop. Clint felt the muscles work even through the saddle, and every part of that pony which his legs touched seemed as hard as steel and full of fast-working bumps which came and went, twisted his saddle under him, and made him wonder if it was going to stay. It seemed like sometimes that Smoky was headed one way and his saddle another. He wasn't always sure of the whereabouts of that pony's head, and in all his riding that's what he wanted to keep track of most, 'cause losing track of a horse's head at them times is something like riding blindfolded. A rider would prepare for one kind of a jolt and meet another, which would cause things to scatter considerable. Clint was still straight up and on top when Smoky's hard jumps finally dwindled down to crow hops and then a stop. That pony was needing wind mighty bad, and as his nostrils opened wide, was taking in the necessary air. He felt a hand a-rubbing along his neck, and wild-eyed, ears cocked back at the cowboy that was still there, he stood and heard him talk. "You done a mighty fine job, little horse," says Clint, "and I'd have been disappointed a lot not to have found that kind of spirit in a horse like you." If Smoky had been raised amongst humans like a dog and been with 'em steady that way, he'd have had a hunch or felt what Clint said and meant. But Smoky was a wild horse of the flats and mountains, and even though the sound of Clint's tone and the feel of his hand soothed him some, he would buck again and again. It was his instinct to fight the human, and he would fight till that human showed he could handle him and proved a friend. That had to be done gradual, and Smoky had no way to know as yet that man could be a friend of his. Not while the breaking was going on, anyway, for through that spell a horse is made to do things he sometimes don't want to do, and which all keeps down the confidence that would come faster if that didn't have to be done. Smoky was doing some tall figuring as he stood there trembling and wondering if there wasn't anything that he could get by with. He'd been made to do things just as that cowboy pleased, and he'd found no say in the goings-on, none at all. If he could only have bucked him off, that would have pleased him a lot. But the little horse didn't know that he wouldn't have won anything by that. He didn't know he was on this earth for the purpose of the human, and that if he did throw one man, another would climb him till finally he'd have to give in and go through a lot of grief the while. Smoky felt a light slap on his neck. "Come on, young feller," says the cowboy. "Let's see you trot around the corral a while." But Smoky bucked more than he trotted. The cowboy let him, and when his head would come up, he'd keep him on the go till finally there seemed to be no buck in the horse at all. "I reckon that'll be enough for you today," says Clint as he headed Smoky for the side of the corral and made him face the bars to a stop. He then reached for the pony's left ear and twisted it some, just enough to keep that pony's attention on the twist of that ear most while he got off. Clint touched the ground with his right foot and keeping his left in the stirrup, at the same time keeping close to the horse's shoulder and out of the reach of his hind feet. He held that position for a few seconds. Smoky was watching him, shaking like a leaf and ready to paw the daylight out of the cowboy at the first wrong move or sudden jab of a knee. Clint wanted him to watch. This was part of the education, and all that cowboy wanted to teach right then was for Smoky to stand and not to go acting up. Slow and easy, at the same time having complete control of himself and his horse, Clint raised himself up in the saddle again. It was done in a way that only bronc busters know. Smoky never even felt the pull on the saddle as the cowboy climbed on. And if that saddle hadn't even been cinched, it wouldn't have budged then, so neat it was done. Clint climbed on and off a few times that way. Smoky stood and shivered, scared, but willing, it seemed like, to take his medicine. Maybe it had come to his mind that there was no use fighting that cowboy, or else he was getting tired. Anyway, that was the last of it. Smoky felt the cinch loosen, and then slow and easy the saddle was pulled off. About that time he whirled and faced the rider who was holding the saddle. He took a sniff at the hunk of leather and snorted like to say, "Gee, I thought that thing was on me for good." The saddle was set to one side, and the cowboy began rubbing Smoky's back with a gunny sack. and according to the way that pony acted, that felt mighty good. His upper lip stuck out and twitched with every motion of the rubbing, and when Clint finally quit, the little horse's action showed plain that he should do it some more. Clint rubbed again. "I'm afraid," he says as he grinned and rubbed, "that I'm naturally going to spoil you. Here we just got through with the first saddling, and you are beginning to look for favors already." Smoky's picket grounds was moved to a fresh one for that night, and where the grass was tall, aplenty, and green. But somehow his appetite wasn't at its best, and when the break of day come, there was very little sign, as Clint noticed, that the pony had et at all. He'd just stood in one spot, looked like, and seemed to have done tall wondering and figuring instead of feeding. He was ganted up the same as if he'd been rode all that night, and still there was no show of any appetite for the feed that was under and all around him. As Clint worked in the corral busy with other broncs, he'd look through the bars for any show of interest in the little horse. He'd look often, but most every time that pony's position was about the same, and if he did catch him with his head down, he noticed how Smoky was just nibbling at the feed, not eating much. Smoky was taking the change from the life he'd led to what he was now going through kinda hard, harder than the average wild horse ever does. And Clint laid it that the little horse had more brains than the average, more sensitive maybe, and more able to realize. "I guess I'd better lay off of him today," decides the cowboy, as he noticed very little change in him even late that afternoon. He's having a hard time trying to figure things out as it is. It was bright and early the next morning when Clint looked out of the bunkhouse door and noticed Smoky out on the creek bottom. It appeared that the little horse, after figuring and figuring, had come to some sort of decision, and that done and settled had went to eating again, for that's what he was doing when Clint looked out. Smoky was eating like he was trying to make up for the time he'd lost, and he seemed all at peace with everything in general. The cowboy grinned. "I knowed what that son of a gun has decided on," he remarked. "He's going to fight, and I see where I'm sure due for a tossing from that pony today." Clint done his day's work, and after riding and lining out 9 head of rough and kinky broncs, went to where Smoky was picketed, and led him into the corral where he'd been initiated a couple of days before. He was some kind of a different horse than what he'd been that day. His head was higher and more with just one purpose. He didn't shy and snort at every little thing like he did the first time, and Clint noticed that he never seemed to see the saddle as it was eased on his back and cinched. "I don't like the sound of them rollers that's making that noise in them nostrils of yours," he remarked. "They sound to me like you meant business." Smoky did mean business, and even though Clint was doing considerable kidding, he meant business too. He wasn't going to let the little horse get away with anything, for he realized that if he did, it'd be harder than ever to persuade him to be good. He'd have to be treated rough, and Clint didn't want to treat him rough. The cowboy seen the light in Smoky's eyes and understood it. He understood his every action, and they all meant fight. "I'm glad to see so much spirit in you, old boy," he says as he pulled his hat down. "But if you want to fight, I'll have to fight too, and here's hoping the best one of us wins. Let's go." Smoky only shook his head a little as Clint put his hand on his left eye and mounted. He didn't want to notice a little thing like that, which was just as much a warning from him for that cowboy to get set well and solid, for in this next performance things was going to pop worse than ever. There's a big difference between the bucking that comes with the first setting of a bronc and the bucking that comes with the settings that follows afterwards on that same bronc. The first time Smoky was rode, he was just a plain scared pony. Of course his intentions was all to the good towards throwing that cowboy, saddle and all, off. But he was too scared and desperate to try and figure out how that should be done. He'd learned from that first setting that plain bucking wouldn't faze that rider. He'd have to use some science, and with a cool head study out the weak points the rider might have, and work on them weak points till a shadow on the ground tells him the cowboy is leaving. Smoky had learned that it wouldn't get him anything to stampede hot-headed into bucking like he did that first time. Maybe that's what he'd been studying on the last day or so. Anyway, he was some cool horse, and when he bowed his head, this time it was all done deliberate and easy. He lined out with a few easy jumps just to sort of feel out how that cowboy was a setting as a preliminary, and with an eye back on all the movements of the rider as he went, he laid his plans on just how to proceed and get his man. It was just when Clint seemed to be riding his easiest when without warning Smoky broke in two and brought out some mighty wicked saddle-twisting and cowboy-loosening jumps. Crooked, high, and hard-hitting was them jumps. It looked to the horse like his man was loosened at the sudden turning of events and had been shifted to one side a little, and that's just what Smoky was looking for to carry on the program he'd mapped out. It was the first encouragement that pony'd got since he first felt a rope on him. Maybe he could get it over that cowboy yet. He bucked all the harder from the new energy the signs of winning brought him. No chance did he give so that the cowboy would ever get back in the saddle and straight up, and every jump from then on was used as a kind of leverage against the rider. He bucked in a circle, and every time he'd hit the ground, he was his whole length back from where he'd started up. The cowboy was well up on the fork of the saddle and still to one side. Smoky bucked on, and cool as a cucumber in a mountain stream, kept a-watching and took care that he didn't buck back under him. He was holding his own and looked for signs of the rider loosening some more, but no signs of that showed. The cowboy was still to one side and well up in the saddle, but he sure hung there, and with his left hand on the mecate hackamore rope, he kept his right up in the air and fanned on the same as ever. As the fight kept on, and no show of the cowboy ever loosening up any more was seen, Smoky began to wonder. He'd tried different tactics, and with all his figuring and variety of sidewinding, he couldn't tear away from that hanging hunk of humanity. He was getting tired. His lungs began to call for air, and pretty soon he wasn't so cool no more. All that was in him, science and everything, was brought out on a few more earth-shaking jumps. And when a glance back showed Smoky the rider was still sitting there, he got desperate again and began to see red. He bellered, and at the same time forgot all he'd studied on in the ways of getting his man. The fight didn't last long after that. It was too furious and unscientific. Smoky fought the air, the earth, and everything in general. Nothing in particular was his aim, and pretty soon he lined out in long, easy crow hops, and then a standstill. Clint climbed off as Smoky stood, spraddle-legged, and took in the air. The little horse never seemed to notice him, and in a hazy way felt the rider's hand rubbing around his ears and straightening out his mane. "I knowed you'd give me a tossing today," says Clint. And there was one thing Smoky didn't know. It was that no time during the fight did the cowboy feel he was losing his saddle. A setting to one side the way he had been was just a long-staying holt of his, something like a half Nelson with the wrastler. Poor Smoky had lost again, but in a way he'd won. He'd won the heart of a cowboy, 'cause through that fight that cowboy's feelings was for the little horse. He'd seen, understood, and admired the show of thinking qualities and the spirit which was Smoky's. The idea might be got, on account of Smoky being the steady loser, that his spirit would get jarred and finally break. But if anybody thinking so could have seen that horse the next day, that idea would have been scattered considerable. His time on the picket rope had been spent on more thinking and figuring, and the way he went after the tall grass showed he meant to be in shape to carry through whatever the new scheme was. And some would have thought it queer to have seen how Smoky, the steady loser in the contest, seemed to hold no grudge or hate against the winning cowboy. As it was, that pony seemed to welcome that human a lot as he walked towards him the next morning, and the way he rubbed his head against the shoulder of that smiling rider showed that the fights in the corral had got to be some friendly. Both was mighty serious, and both meant to win in them fights. But soon as they was over and the dust cleared, there was a feeling the likes of when two friends have an argument. When the argument comes to an end, both the loser and winner are ready to grin, shake hands, and be friends again. Smoky had lost out twice in trying to dodge out from under his man, but he was nowheres near convinced as yet that it couldn't be done. The third time Clint climbed him, that pony bucked harder than ever, and that cowboy just sat up there and let him. Clint had whipped some horses for bucking that way, but he'd whipped them because it was natural orneriness that made 'em buck. With Smoky it was different. There was no meanness in him so far. That pony was confident that nothing could set him once he got onto the hang of knowing how to buck real well. And all he wanted was to be showed for sure that Clint could really sit there and ride him through his worst that way. After that was done, he'd most likely quit. The first couple of times Smoky was rode, and after he'd quit his bucking, there hadn't been much more to it excepting that Clint would just run him around a bit and turn him a few times till the hump was well down on that pony's back. Smoky had got to thinking that was all would ever come of being corralled and saddled, and so he was some surprised when after the bucking spell was over at the third setting to see the corral gate open wide, the cowboy on him again, and heading him for open country. Smoky took to the high ridges like a duck takes to water. He trotted out like a good horse, and then was put into a long lope. Covering territory felt mighty good to the little horse for a change, and he wasn't caring much where the cowboy lined him out to. For a spell he'd forgot the weight on his back. His ears was straight ahead, and the hand he felt on his neck only reminded some that somebody was with him. He was needing that change after being bested again like he'd been that third time. Clint had won once more, and Smoky was a lot in favor of something, most anything, to drive off the feeling he'd got in losing. He was taking advantage of the run-in that way, and sashayed at a good clip. All went fine till of a sudden a jackrabbit scared out of his hiding place jumped up and right under Smoky's nose. He shied straight up and to one side, and at the same time he was scared more by the wing of Clint's chap, which had curled up and slapped along his shoulder. Away he went to bucking once again. The first few jumps was mighty wicked, but they didn't last. He'd already had his buck out not long before, and pretty soon he straightened into a lope once again. Clint let him lope a ways, then turned him and headed him back to the corrals, stopped him there, turned him a few times, and started him out a ways, only to turn him and bring him back again. That went on for a few minutes, and then Smoky was unsaddled and put on the picket rope once more. The run had tired Smoky a little and give him an appetite. He didn't do so much figuring on how to get his man that night, and instead he grazed more, rested some, and even slept a little. When he was led to the corral the next day and the saddle put on, he even neglected to watch the cowboy and begin to show interest in the broncs that was in another corral. His ambitions hadn't allowed him to do that before, but somehow things had changed. Figuring ways and means of throwing off that rider had got to be tiresome, especially when nothing but disappointment was ever got by it. And besides, that saddle and man was getting so they wasn't so bad to stand up under no more. But as neutral as Smoky showed and felt, that little son of a gun bucked again. Of course there was nothing in his bucking that was so wicked as it had been in them first 3 saddlings. It was more that he felt he should buck some. It made him feel better, and besides he was wanting exercise. But he raised the dust and pounded the earth in good shape even at that, and that play of his would have throwed many a man. Another run like the one of the day before, a few turnings and teachings on the feel of the rein, and Smoky was through for another day. He was getting used to the lay of the program Clint had set, and the new game that was brought on right along as he was rode began to draw the pony's interest. Then one day the cowboy began dragging a rope on him. He let it drag quite a ways, and even though Smoky watched it mighty close so it wouldn't circle around his legs and throw him like most ropes always did, it didn't worry him much. Pretty soon Clint coiled the rope up and made a loop which he started whirling in the air. The whirling was slow and easy at first and done with a small loop. Smoky looked back all interest and snorted a little. He wondered what that rope was doing up there and what Clint was up to. But nothing happened, only that the whirling kept up. The loop was gradually made bigger, and then it was throwed on the ground a ways in front of him. Smoky shied and snorted, and the coils shot out, straightened, and all of it pulled up again by the cowboy. But he didn't try to run away from it. He hadn't forgot the education he'd received from the long, soft picket rope. He'd learned from it that it didn't pay to stampede when a rope was around, on account that them ropes had a way of stopping him that couldn't at all be argued with. Loops was made, throwed out, and drug in again, one right after another. They went one side one time and another side the next, then in front and back, till Smoky began to lose fear no matter which way the rope went or how it coiled up. It was at the point when he was beginning to lose interest in the game that Clint roped a small bush. The rope tightened on it, and Smoky pulled. He pulled more in wonder what was holding him than with the idea of what he should do. But anyway, the bush came out and headed straight for Smoky as it did. He struck at it and would have left from there, but Clint held him and made him face it. Smoky shook like a leaf as slow but sure the cowboy kept a-pulling the bush towards him. He struck again and snorted as it touched his front feet, and he bucked a couple of jumps when he felt it up along his shoulder, but there was no getting away from it. The way that bush moved, it looked like something vicious to Smoky, and when Clint took the rope off of it and held it out under the pony's nose for him to see what it was, the little horse near showed signs of shame for getting scared. Loose stumps, branches, pieces of old wagons, and everything that could be drug or moved was roped. Anything that was light enough was pulled up for Smoky to investigate, and each time he was showed that he'd been shying and fighting for no reason, till finally nothing could be found that brought any more than a snort from him. An old coal oil can was then roped and brought up a rattling under Smoky's nose, but he even stood his ground at that. He was learning to pull on the rope and made to drag things as heavy as a yearling critter. Then gradually Clint made him keep the rope tight and hold it that way till a couple of light jerks on it made him give slack. All that took time, and the cowboy learned him only one thing each day, sometimes very little of that one thing. But as the days went by, it all accumulated to a lot. It done Clint's heart good to watch the way Smoky was taking to things. His little ears worked back and forth, and with his eyes he never missed a move that went on. His nostrils quivered at all that was new, and the cowboy was noticing with a glad feeling that the pony was putting a lot of trust in him. A word from that cowboy or a touch from his hand was getting to mean a lot when that pony was dubious or at the point of scaring at some new happening. Clint hunted up a bunch of cattle one day and acquainted Smoky with some pointers in the handling of the critters. He'd haze the horse and the bunch, cut out some fat, kinky yearling, and make him put his interest on that yearling only. All was a puzzle to Smoky at first, and he had no idea of what he should do. But Clint gave him his time, and coaching him along, it wasn't but a few days when the little horse understood some of what was wanted of him. In the meantime, the teachings with the rope wasn't left behind. That went along with working cattle, and once in a while Clint would snare some big calf and make Smoky keep his nose along that rope while the calf circled, bucked, and bellered. Smoky showed signs of liking all that went on. He took interest in it the same way as a kid would to some new game. He liked to chase the wild-eyed cow, turn her when she didn't want to be turned, and put her where she didn't want to be put. He liked to hold the rope tight on one of the critters and feel that he was the one that was keeping her down. It all struck him as a kind of a game where every animal before him had to do as he and the cowboy wished. He was all for catching on, and not a nerve in him was idle as Clint would take him of evenings and ride him out for a spell, and chase, cut out, or rope at the critter. Them goings-on had his mind occupied, and the fact that he'd figure and think on the subject between times was proved by the way he'd go at things in a decided and knowing-how way, when the day before the same thing had left him puzzled and wondering. That little work he was getting, and the all-heart interest he was finding in it, had settled him to the big change from the free life he'd led with the old buckskin horse and the bunch of mares and colts. His mammy was even forgotten, and instead there'd sprouted in him something that made him take a liking for the long, lanky cowboy that came to see and play with him every day. He'd got to finding a lot of pleasure in doing just what that cowboy wanted him to do, and when that was done, there was a hankering in him to do just a little bit more. That's the way Clint wanted to keep him. Just a hankering to do more would get results, and he was careful to see that the little horse didn't tire on the work. He wanted to make it play for him and keep it that way as long as he could, for he knowed that was the way to keep Smoky's heart and spirit all in one hunk and intact. Chapter 7 of Smoky the Cowhorse. Smoky Shows His Feelings. Jeff Nix, cow foreman of the Rocking R outfit, was riding along and headed for the horse camp where Clint was breaking horses. Spring works was over, and Jeff, thinking it was a good time for him to do a little lone riding and kind of visit the camps of the outfit, had left his straw boss in charge of the wagon, caught his best horse, and strung out to cover some of the Rocking R territory. It was a hot day. Not a breath stirred the air, and as the old cowman rode, he lifted his hat often to kind of let a fresh supply of atmosphere come in underneath. His big brown horse was covering ground in a running walk, and Jeff, keeping him down to that gait, wasn't passing a coulee nor a draw without a glance in it and then to the skyline above. It was his habit as a cowman to keep his eye on the job while riding, and for the good of the company or his own, nary a thing had ever escaped his vision unless it was just too far for that vision to reach. It was as he was riding along natural that way that he noticed a thin streak of dust to the right of him quite a ways. That dust wasn't made by anything traveling fast, and even though it reached up in the air good and high, Jeff could see at a glance that the dust was stirred by something dragging. He stopped his horse so as to get a steadier view, and pretty soon he could make out the shape of a horse underneath that dust. Something that looked like a turned pack was fastened or hanging on to him and dragging alongside. Jeff had seen many happenings on the range between man and horse, and from that figured to always investigate anything that suspicioned of something gone wrong, and to investigate quick. He put his horse in a high lope. Down draws, over rolling hills, and across dog towns he went, all at the same speed, and pretty soon he comes to where there's only a small ridge between him and what he wanted to investigate. It was then that he figured it best to take it slow till he'd seen just what was up. If some rider had got caught in his rig in some way as a horse fell, and that horse was wild and unbroke, riding in on a high lope would only make things worse and cause the horse to stampede. Nobody knowed that better than Jeff did. He got off his horse, walked a ways, and peeking through the tall grass, seen the whole goings-on at a glance. 50 yards below him was a mouse-colored horse. Looked like a half-broke bronc to him on account of the way the hackamore was rigged. But that horse didn't act like half-broke. He was going through a performance that most gentle-broke range horses wouldn't put up with. And that was to half carry and half drag a man, and on the wrong side. Jeff recognized that man as his bronc peeler, Clint, and he was all for rushing down to see what had happened and help, but he held back. He wasn't sure but what the mouse-colored horse would scare and run away at the sight of him, and he couldn't tell but what Clint's hands was fastened to the saddle horn the way he was hanging on. He could see there was still life in the rider, but if the man was conscious, he wasn't showing very good sense by hanging on the wrong side of a half-broke horse that way. Still, as he watched, Jeff began to wonder. He noticed, for one thing, that the horse was headed straight for camp, Clint's camp. And then there was another thing he noticed, and which made him wonder and watch more than ever. The mouse-colored gelding wasn't dragging his man. He was more kind of helping him along, seemed like. Each step that horse took was with care and in favor of the man alongside. The pony watched every move that man made, and if the steps sort of lagged or hesitated, he stopped or slowed down till the man braced up some and went again. Jeff's mouth was wide open with wonder as he watched the goings-on. And when a little while later the gelding happened along a big rock and seen him stop while the man tried to use the rock to get from it up in the saddle, Jeff wondered some more. "By jappers, I've seen and handled thousands of horses," says Jeff, "but I never thought any horse ever had that much sense." The old cowman watched for near a half an hour while Clint tried to get on his horse. He seen the horse stand there, all patience and helping the best he could. And finally, with the help of the rock, the favoring of the horse, and the little strength the man had, and all put together, Clint was setting in the saddle at last. The hackamore reins was hanging loose. Nothing was holding that pony from bucking, stampeding, or doing anything he pleased. But he stepped slow and easy, and ears cocked ahead, packed his man to camp with the same care any human would take. Jeff got on his horse and, keeping well behind, followed. What he'd just seen had got him to the point where he began talking to himself, his horse, and the country around. Yes, sir, by jappers, and he let Clint get on him from the wrong side, too. Why, this doggone old gentle horse I'm riding now wouldn't let me do that. But then, maybe I better not be too sure about that. I'm beginning to believe, from what I've just seen, that there's things going on in horses' think tanks that's mighty surprising, and which don't come out till the right time shows up. A couple of hours and the camp was reached. Jeff looked around the big corrals as he rode closer for signs of Clint and the mouse-colored bronc, and sure enough, there the both of 'em are. Clint is still in the saddle and to all appearance unconscious. The gelding is standing by the corral gate, still and waiting. The cowman rode on towards him, but he soon had to stop, for he noticed as the gelding sees him how by that pony's actions he wasn't for standing in one spot no longer at the sight of a strange rider coming on him that way. Jeff had to maneuver around considerable to keep that horse from hightailing it. The only way he could do it was to go back the way he came till out of sight. Once there, he circled around till he came up on the camp from the opposite side. The corrals and a long shed was between him and the half-broke horse with his unconscious rider. Jeff left his horse out of sight, and hugging close to the shed, made his way to where the mouse-colored gelding had been. A peek through a hole in the wall showed him the horse was still there and Clint still in the saddle. How to proceed from then on was a sort of ticklish proposition. Jeff didn't want the pony to get scared, run away, and throw the hurt rider, and still he couldn't let the rider stay where he was. He had to take a chance and do the best he could. Around the corner of the shed he came, and slow and easy showed himself to the wild-eyed gelding. He talked to him, and that seemed to help some, for the little horse stood his ground. Stood his ground is correct, but Jeff had hesitated somehow from coming any closer. He noticed a light in that pony's eyes which warned him plain to keep his distance, and even though Jeff was half peeved and half leery at the stand the pony had took, he couldn't help but admire the show of liking that half-broke gelding had for the rider that was still unconscious in the saddle and laying with his head on the pony's bowed neck. The horse's actions had all been a puzzle to Jeff at first, and as he finally understood, it all left him mighty surprised and in a trance with wonder. He'd expected that horse to start running away at the sight of him, but instead he was showing fight. The pony wasn't wanting to go no further with the hurt rider. He wasn't going to trust no strange human with that helpless partner of his. 2 months or more had passed since Clint and Smoky had met in the dust of the Bear Corral. In that time the man and horse had had fights. Some had been mighty wicked, and the wild horse would have killed the man too if the chance had come. But all through them fights the man had won. Slow and easy, but he'd won. Then gradually Smoky began to get confidence in the human, and then a liking. He'd got to looking for his company, and would nicker with a glad feeling as he'd see that human coming towards him of evenings, and he'd let go the length of his picket rope to meet him. Steady, good treatment from the rider, no matter what the horse had done, had won the pony's heart, till the little horse could near be seen smiling with the happy feeling that was his every time Clint came, saddled him, and rode him out for a little play with the rope and critter. That's the way Smoky's feelings had come to be for the bow-legged rider, and taking all as was, it's no wonder the horse showed fight when a strange human appeared. In his life, Smoky had seen no other but Clint. He knowed him, but he didn't know the others, and he had no more love for them than he had when he was first run in from his free range. Them others was still enemies to him, and right then when that pony felt his partner was depending on him most, he was sure ready to paw the daylight out of that stranger if he came any closer. He was his enemy, and according to his way of thinking, he was or should be Clint's enemy too. Jeff stood there figuring for quite a spell, a-trying to digest and believe what that pony showed. It couldn't come to him to hurt or kill such a horse so as to get the man, and he'd just decided to get his rope, throw a loop over his head, and snub him close to the corral when the rider began to show signs of life. "Come to, Clint. hollered the cowman as he noticed the rider move, "and get off that horse." Clint raised his head some at the sound of the voice, and as Jeff kept speaking to him, he made a big effort to understand and try to do as he was told. Pain showed in his face as he tried to straighten himself in the saddle, and as Jeff feared that the rider would lose consciousness again, he hollered at him not to try straighten up, but just slide off and hang on. With a lot of pain and time and coaching from Jeff, Clint finally managed to raise one leg over the cantle of the saddle and let himself slide to the ground. Smoky stood still as a statue and as solid. His eyes was on Jeff with a steady warning for him to keep his distance, and Jeff did. "Hang on to the saddle," coached Jeff. "Try and get the horse through the gate in the corral, and I'll close the gate on him." That was done in time, and as the gate was closed, Clint's hands went limp and he fell to the ground. Lucky it was that Jeff could reach him through the corral bars, but he had to do considerable maneuvering even then to get the cowboy through and under so as not to stir Smoky. And it was a mighty good thing for Jeff as he picked Clint up and started towards the house that there was bars high and strong between him and that pony, for as high and strong as the corral was, Jeff worried some, and looking back over his shoulder as he went, wondered if it would hold him. The sun had sunk away and dark had come before Clint came to well enough so things was plain to him and he could talk. Jeff had made him as comfortable as possible, boiled some jerky, and made a strong broth which he was holding under Clint's nose for him to sniff at. That cowboy sniffed, looked around, and then said, "Where's Smoky?" "If you mean that mouse-colored fighting son of a gun of a horse you was on," says Jeff, "why, he's in the corral, and a-fretting his head that I'm going to eat you up." Clint couldn't quite get the meaning of that just then, and he asked, "I wonder if you wouldn't go take the saddle off of him and put him on the picket rope where he'd get something to eat. He's gentle, and you can handle him easy." Jeff snorted and laughed. "Gentle? I wouldn't try to handle him if you'd give me this whole outfit. I'm not enough of a bronc fighter no more, and that ain't all. That pony is just a hankering for me to stick my breezer through that corral." Smoky circled around the corral, not at all minding the saddle that was on him. He wasn't caring for any grass either. He was too peeved and restless. If Clint had been right side up and able, things would have been different, and Smoky would have hardly even noticed the stranger. There seems to be a heap of difference in the feelings of any thinking animal when a pardner is sick or dying. The little horse knowed as well as any human that something had went wrong with his pardner, and the appearance of the stranger at such a time was worrying him. The next day was well along and the sun getting high when Jeff helped Clint on his feet and half carried him towards the corral where Smoky had put in the night. Clint staggered on alone from the gate, and the little horse nickering came to meet him. His ears was well ahead, and his eyes was a-shining. He looked all interest and like he was wanting to ask questions. He then spotted Jeff, and at the sight of him his expression changed. His eyes showed fire, and his ears laid back on his neck. "Well, I'll be daggoned," says Clint as he noticed the horse's actions. He looked back at the old cowman and grinned, wondering. But the old cowman wasn't grinning any. Jeff figured it best for him to vanish for a spell. Smoky was unsaddled and put on good feed and water, which all seemed to take Clint a powerful lot of time. But he finally showed up, and Jeff helped him back to the house. It was on the way over that Clint began to speak, and on a subject that had been on his mind for a long time. "You know, Jeff," he says, "I think the time has come for me to quit riding broncs. I feel like I better quit, especially after this last thing that's happened to me." "What did happen, anyway?" asks Jeff. "It was all on account of a fool cow," starts Clint. "She showed some signs of wanting to leave the country soon as she seen me riding up on her. And being she was good and fast, I figured it'd be a good time to line Smoky out after her and let him turn her over a few times. I throwed my rope, but the loop didn't land good. It just sort of sailed in front of her, and she stepped in it. About that time I jerked up my slack, and I jerked it too hard. Down went the critter all in a heap and sudden. So sudden that with the speed Smoky was going, he couldn't stop in time, and first thing we knowed, we both was straddle the critter. But she didn't stay down long. She got up just at the wrong time and just right to yank Smoky's front feet from under him, raise him up in the air with me on top, and just turned us a couple of somersaults before we landed on the other side. I didn't know much more after that till now. I just sort of felt a weight on my back, and that was all. Maybe I got under Smoky somehow as we fell, but I think it's that fool cow that stepped on me and separated me from my thoughts. I'll most likely be all right in a few days, but I recognize this ailing. I got hurt a few years ago from an ornery black horse I was breaking for the 3 C's, and being that I don't want this ailing to come back with me to stay, I figure I better quit riding rough ones. There's other parts of me that's hankering for me to quit too, and if you'll let me join the boys at the wagon, I'm mighty willing that somebody else gets my job here." Clint was quiet for a spell, and then pretty soon he goes on. "But there's one favor I want to ask, Jeff, if you'll let me stay with the outfit. I want to ask that you'll let me keep Smoky in my string and as long as I'm with the company." What the cowboy had just said came from what he'd figured, thought out, and worried on ever since he'd first set eyes on Smoky. Clint liked all horses, maybe a little too much. But even at that, he liked Smoky still more. The fear that somebody else would lay claim to the horse had him doing some tall thinking. He knowed that as long as he was breaking horses, his work would come with raw broncs only, and all half-broke horses would be took away from him as fast as he'd turn 'em out. Smoky would had to go too. And that's where the hitch came. He figured he'd have to quit breaking horses and go to riding the range, and take the big chance that the horse might be took away from him even then. He'd noticed how Jeff had stood, watched, and admired Smoky, and if signs of a human wanting anything right bad ever showed, there was never no signs more visible than Clint had seen on Jeff's features when the horse was in sight. There'd been only one way out for the cowboy, and he'd took it. There was a worried look on his face as he glanced at the foreman and waited for him to answer. But Jeff didn't seem to want to answer right then, and instead he asked, "How long have you had that horse up, Clint?" "2 months and maybe a little over," says Clint, wondering some at the question. "Wasn't there a couple of boys here about a month ago to get all the broncs you'd started?" "Yes." "Well then, why didn't you let 'em have that horse Smoky? He was as well broke then as any of the broncs the boys came after, wasn't he?" Clint began to take interest in looking at the wall of the bunkhouse about that time. He grinned a little and finally answered, "Well, Jeff, I guess you know why." Jeff did know why, and knowed it a plenty. What he'd seen going on between Smoky and the cowboy the day before and that morning had already answered why Clint had hid the horse when the boys came to haze away the broncs he'd started. The foreman grinned back at the laid-up rider and placed a hand on his shoulder, the same as to say that he understood. "As long as I'm with this outfit," he says, "and which from all indications will be a long time, you're mighty welcome to join the wagon as one of my riders. You'll be getting top-hand wages, too, Clint, the best string of ponies I can put together, and as for Smoky, why, I sure would like that horse." Clint's heart fluttered up his throat and came near choking him. Yep, I'd sure like to have him, went on the foreman. But after thinking it all over, I figure that horse really belongs to you more than he does to the company or me. He's a one-man horse, and you're the one man, Clint. And even if the horse took a liking to me, which I know won't happen, I'll sure never want to take him away from you, not after what I've seen. Clint had underfigured considerable when he'd said how he thought he'd be all right again in a few days. A week passed, and very little strength had gathered from his hips up. His back felt as broke, and he had no power to straighten up again once he'd stoop. He couldn't even pick up a spur. A new rider came one day and took up Clint's work where he'd left it. From that time on, Clint hung around the corrals a-talking and watching the new hand ride. And when he wasn't by the corrals, he could be seen in the shade of the big willows in the creek bottom where Smoky was picketed. Clint had looked at Smoky in a new way since Jeff had come and left. The visit of the old cowboy had brought out things in that little horse which Clint hadn't dreamed of ever being in any horse. He'd been mighty surprised, and then sort of proud that he could raise such a feeling in the gelding. The horse was good as his, too. That put the cap on his worries of losing him, and all was well. A month went by. The roundup wagons was stringing out for the fall works, and the cow with the big wiener calf was hunting a hole. There was 22 riders with Jeff Nick's wagon, and amongst 'em, a grinning from ear to ear at some joke a cowboy had sprung, was Clint, and riding Smoky. Long days of rest had put that cowboy in shape to ride, but not to ride broncs. And when he at last felt that he could make a hand at riding circle, herd, and night guard, Smoky had been saddled and rode to the home ranch where the wagon was to start from. Smoky'd had a long month's rest before Clint saddled and rode him out that morning. And even though the rider looked okay again to the little horse, there was a feel from the hackamore rein that as much as asked him not to buck. He'd bucked that day when Clint had met too much cow, and as far as that goes, he'd bucked some at every saddling. But as the cowboy started him out for open country and the home ranch that morning, he was made to feel that he should keep his head up for once and line out without a kink. The home ranch had been reached a couple of days later, and there's where Smoky'd got his first look at a busy cow outfit's main camp. Cowboys was everywhere, and more of 'em than he could keep track of. Big corrals full of horses, and more horses under the big sheds. Wagons and tents, and when the roundup cook rushed out of a log house to one side and pranced up to try and shake hands with Clint, Smoky let out a snort and shied out of reach. "Daggone it, Clint," says that hombre, "I was told you'd quit riding broncs. What in Sam Hill do you call that spooky thing you're setting on now?" "Some horse," answers Clint, grinning. Smoky felt some easier when he was finally unsaddled and turned in amongst the other saddle horses. He took a good roll, shook himself, and proceeded to get acquainted. It didn't worry him none that very few of the ponies seemed to want his company, and he was mighty busy going from one of the big corrals into another and giving 'em all the once-over. He finally run across a bay gelding which seemed some familiar, and Smoky must have seemed the same to that gelding, too, for both of 'em started to show interest at once and came to meet one another. Necks bowed, they touched nostrils. Some explaining and understanding must have went on, 'cause it wasn't but a few minutes later when each was scratching the other's neck like two brothers. And that's what they was, brothers. The bay horse was none other than the little colt growed up, and which his mammy had brought in the bunch one day over 3 years before. Signs showed where the saddle had been on his back, too. A cowboy had run him in a couple of weeks before, and passed the remark as he piled his rope on him that, "This little bay horse sure shows the makings of a cow horse." Jeff had agreed, And that's how come Smoky found him in amongst the saddle horses that day. He'd showed some of how he'd took a natural liking for the bay, and if one didn't recognize a brother in the other, the way they went at a scratching each other's withers couldn't have meant much. It was through an intermission at wither scratching that Smoky seen Clint open the outside gate of the corral and walk in. Alongside of him was Jeff Nix, who'd come along to point out Clint's string of ponies. Smoky watched them two for quite a spell. He watched Jeff the most, but pretty soon went to scratching his brother's withers again. Clint was all right now and well able to take care of himself, he must have thought. Anyway, there wasn't the feeling in him that Clint needed any protection. Clint had come to see him that evening, and he'd noticed as his partner came that some of the cowboys was watching him from the next corral. He looked over Clint's shoulder at him and sent out a long whistling snort. "I'm glad Clint didn't break all the broncs like he did that one," remarked one of the boys as he seen the fight in that pony's eyes. "Yep," says another, "he sure made a one-man horse out of him." Smoky was turned out in the big pasture that night with the other horses. Him and his brother paired off soon as they was out of the corrals, and fed together till daybreak brought a rider on the skyline who corralled 'em all for the new day's work. That day's work started early. Sun up found all the boys on their horses. The chuck wagon, bed wagon, and wood wagon teams was all hooked on and ready to start at a wave of the hand from Jeff. Jeff waved, and away all went through the big gates leading out of the home ranch. 3 wagons strung out, a remuda saddle bunch of 200 saddle horses followed, and on the swing sides of the whole outfit 22 riders, riding good and bad horses, loped along. The fall roundup had started.